Hey friends, tonight, let's explore one of history's most baffling connections. The belief that comets could ruin your hairstyle and your life. You've just stepped into the late 1600s, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, rosewater, and maybe a bit of old cheese from your neighbor's wig stand. It's twilight in a sleepy European town, and people are nervously glancing upward, whispering under their breath. There it is, a comet, a streak of glowing white, tearing across the ink-black sky. Someone clutches their head as if to protect their scalp from celestial disaster. Because in this world, that blazing tail means your bangs are about to betray you. Before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And don't forget to comment on your location and what time it is right now. Are you somewhere foggy and mysterious? Or do you have clear skies to check for ominous comets tonight? Dim those lights, fire up a fan for that cozy background sound, and let's settle in for the journey ahead. You're walking down a cobbled street with your bonnet tied tight, not because of the wind, but because of superstition. You pass by the wig maker's shop, its windows darkened early for protection. Next door, a hairdresser hastily scribbles something in chalk on a board outside his door. No comet cuts today. Reschedule after Mercury returns to normal. It's not a joke. People believe this stuff deeply, and why wouldn't they? Everything strange seems to follow a comet. Cows stop producing milk, bread refuses to rise, and most crucially, people get bad haircuts, or worse, bad hair days, the kind that ruin reputations, marriages, and social standing. You see, back then, a person's hair was more than vanity. It was social capital, marital bait, moral compass, and mood ring all rolled into one. If your curls drooped mysteriously or your fringe frizzed out like hay, you were either sick, sinful, or cursed by a cosmic force. Comets, being mysterious and irregular, were the perfect scapegoat. A nobleman in France, for instance, once recorded in his diary that the sudden appearance of a comet in 1680 directly coincided with the failure of his favorite pomade. His hair, once majestic and lacquered into sweeping waves, fell flat and lifeless. He blamed the heavens, not humidity. Certainly not the fact that his stylist had recently switched to a cheaper beeswax. Over in England, a bishop allegedly canceled a sermon because his wig curled backward overnight, something he attributed to heavenly vapors disturbed by the serpent-tailed star. No one questioned it. They simply prayed harder and tied their bonnets tighter. And what about the common folk? Oh, they weren't spared. Village barbers began keeping records of celestial events to avoid blame. Some even offered comet protection prayers with their usual trims. One enterprising barber in the Dutch countryside claimed his shears were blessed by an astronomer turned monk. He charged double during meteor showers, and people paid. You might chuckle now lying in bed with your LED lamp and smart humidifier, but in the 1600s, people genuinely believed hair could absorb cosmic misfortune. There were even rules: don't brush your hair under a waxing moon, never braid when Saturn is high, and for heaven's sake, do not cut your bangs within 3 days of a comet's appearance. Some towns even published little almanacs with safe dates for grooming right next to the sewing schedule and the local tax notices. The connection between appearance and astrology wasn't new. Ancient Babylonian texts suggest comets predicted kings' downfalls. But by the 17th century, things got more personal. The Renaissance had brought a renewed interest in the individual, and that included how your hair looked when Mercury was in retrograde. In households with servants, a sudden tangle in the mistress's hair could get a maid dismissed. Imagine trying to explain that no, you didn't curse Lady Annabelle's coiffure, you just forgot to heat the curling rod. Not good enough. Better to blame Halley's Comet. There's even a record from a German town where a council convened to investigate whether an entire village's bad hair month could be due to astral misalignment. Spoiler. It was winter and humid, but they still fined a traveling stargazer for bringing errant light. Let's not forget the fashion implications. Hair trends shifted dramatically after major comet sightings. In France, the 1618 comet sparked a wave of falling star fringes, irregular cuts, mimicking a comet's tail. They were believed to protect wearers by confusing the celestial forces. You can't curse what already looks cursed was apparently a real motto. Imagine explaining that to your stylist today. But was there any scientific basis? Could cosmic activity mess with our follicles? Well, not directly, but anxiety. That's another story. Imagine a town whispering doomsday, panicking, sleeping less, and suddenly everyone's hair is thinning. Stress, dear listener, is powerful. Even now, you know it makes your pillow look like a tumbleweed in the morning. Back then, they didn't know about cortisol or the impact of sleepless nights. They blamed the stars, not the system. Some scholars argue this period reflected more than hair anxiety. It showed a deep human need to make sense of chaos. Comets were unpredictable, bright, and terrifying. Linking them to something tangible like hair made them feel controllable. If your curls collapsed, you could adjust your schedule, say a prayer, or buy a charm. It was easier than accepting that the universe doesn't owe you a pattern. And yes, let's address the uncomfortable irony. Many astronomers who made charts about comet paths had pretty wild hair themselves. There's a famous portrait of Johannes Hevelius, the father of lunar mapping, sporting what can only be described as cosmic chaos chic. He looked like he lost a fight with a harpsichord. You begin to wonder, were bad haircuts simply part of the job? So maybe, just maybe, they weren't overreacting. They were doing what humans always do, trying to make sense of a messy, unpredictable world with whatever tools they had. Even if those tools included herbal charms, prayer circles, and tragically uneven bangs. You haven't even adjusted your pillow yet, and already the comet is getting blamed for something else, this time your cousin's engagement being delayed. As you settle deeper into your blanket, let's walk further into the world of 17th century comet dread, where astronomy wasn't about understanding the stars, it was about surviving them, at least in the court of public opinion. You see, comets weren't just weird streaks in the sky. They were omens, harbingers, cosmic side-eyes from the heavens. And to the people of that time, if your life took a turn for the worse after a comet passed by, you didn't question your own choices. You looked up and pointed. There's something almost comforting about it, actually. Imagine you fail your math test trip on your cloak and accidentally insult your boss's wig. Is it your fault? Nope. The comet did it. Venus weeps, they'd say, or Mars is angry. And just like that, the burden shifts. In an era before weather forecasts, antibiotics, or even reliable shampoo, the sky was the original therapist, cryptic, judgmental, and totally inaccessible. But it made people feel like someone was watching that chaos had meaning, including, of course, the chaos atop your scalp. The deeper fear wasn't the comet itself, it was what might follow. Famine, war, plagues, bad poetry, in that list, an unruly hairdo might seem minor. But don't be fooled. For aristocrats, a scandalous fringe could tarnish a reputation faster than adultery. For merchants, a hair-like crisis might be interpreted as divine punishment, leading to fewer sales. Even ordinary folks started walking around with their heads covered for weeks after a comet appeared, just in case it tried to steal their follicles. Think of it like an early form of tinfoil hat, but made of lace and fear. Let's take a detour to a particularly dramatic example, the Great Comet of 1618. It lit up the skies of Europe for nearly 2 months and sparked everything from apocalyptic sermons to fashion meltdowns. In Prague, astrologers advised nobles not to change their appearance during this period. The face you show the sky, one pamphlet warned, is the fate it returns to you. You might interpret that as poetic nonsense, but back then people literally slept in uncomfortable headgear to keep their hairstyles intact, fearing the wrath of the tale. Over in Italy, a famous poet rewrote an entire epic after blaming the comet for a creative slump. His excuse: the stars were misaligned, and therefore so were his metaphors. Meanwhile, the upper classes in Paris held secret midnight vigils to pray for the return of proper coiffure. These weren't ironic gatherings. There were candles, sobbing, a hairbrush placed at the altar. What's particularly odd is that many of these fears were driven by books. Yes, even then misinformation traveled fast. Pamphlets were cheaply printed and widely read. And if someone slapped together a celestial calendar with ominous little icons next to comet sightings, skulls, rats, a pair of crossed combs, people believed it, especially when they matched the date to their recent hair disaster. One infamous example is the Almanac of Starry Troubles, printed in 1651. Its author, a failed barber turned amateur astrologer, claimed that comets influenced not only weather and health, but also hair texture. Curly hair, Mars influence. Oily hair, Venus in turmoil. Bald spot, are you my friend of angered Saturn? The charts were nonsense but wildly popular. So popular that the man was invited to give a public lecture and fainted from stage fright. The crowd took it as a sign from the heavens. Of course they did. Back in the streets, vendors sold comet charms, little pouches of herbs, sometimes containing strands of someone else's hair. Supposedly, if you carried the hair of someone with comet immunity, you were safe. That poor person probably bald by 30. And yet, blessed. Even hairstyles began to reflect celestial panic. You had the starfall bun, the comet twist, and the rather dramatic crater locks, which involved backcombing the hair to resemble meteor impact. Some of these styles were actually kind of cool. Others looked like someone had slept through a thunderstorm in a hayloft. But why hair? Why not say buttons or boots? The answer may lie in symbolism. Hair was one of the few physical attributes you could control, alter, or display publicly. It was your interface with society and with fate. A comet was mysterious, beautiful, and untouchable. Hair, same deal, but far more likely to end up frizzy. This obsession even crept into court cases. In one German town, a woman sued her neighbor for celestial interference, claiming that a comet caused her hair to fall out after using the neighbor's well water. The judge, baffled, called in a priest. The priest blamed the moon. The case was dismissed. And yes, there were skeptics. A few early scientists, Galileo among them, rolled their eyes at all this. Galileo himself mocked comet fear in letters, noting that People feared them as cats fear cucumbers. But even he stopped short of addressing the hair connection. Perhaps he didn't want to offend anyone mid-perm. This is where the story begins to brush up, pun intended, against something more philosophical. Is our fear of celestial influence really just a projection of our inner chaos? When we don't understand the world, do we look up or do we look in the mirror? It's an academic question that continues today, even if we now blame humidity or flat irons instead of cosmic tales. But imagine just for a moment what it must have felt like to wake up, see a flash of light in the sky, and wonder, what did I do to deserve this? Was it the hair powder I borrowed, the midnight trim during a lunar eclipse, the cursed comb? In that moment, your entire identity might feel wobbly, like a wig in a windstorm. You open your eyes again just a little, because now your mind is drifting towards something truly peculiar, the idea that not only could the heavens dictate your hair's behavior, but your daily grooming habits might invite cosmic judgment. Welcome to the age when brushing your hair wasn't just a routine. It was practically a religious act, performed under celestial supervision. You didn't just comb your hair because it was tangled. No, you did it while minding the sky's mood. And if Mercury was in a huff, or the moon seemed a bit too smug, you might just leave your locks alone and wear a scarf for a week. Let's imagine your morning. You sit at your vanity, a candle flickering beside you. The mirror is hand-polished silver, slightly warped, giving you that early morning Hall of Mirrors effect. Your brush is carved from bone or wood, maybe passed down from someone who once survived a meteor shower with all their follicles intact. You reach up, but then pause, because someone just whispered through your door, "Comet tail in the east." That's code for don't even think about touching that part. In the 17th century, the act of hair grooming became part ritual, part superstition, and part desperate attempt to keep your life from unraveling. And like any good ritual, there were rules, some written, most not. You were advised, for example, never to part your hair during a solar eclipse lest you create a gateway for celestial despair. That was an actual phrase used by a particularly poetic monk from southern France who also claimed that uneven hairlines could attract wandering spirits with long memories and short tempers. Even the materials used in brushes and combs were considered important. Ivory said to repel lunar influence. Bone, which allegedly conducted the Earth's sorrowful vibrations. And wood, from specific trees, ash for courage, willow for beauty, and elm for silence. You had to think carefully about what you were inviting to your scalp every morning, because they believed the universe noticed. Hairdressers, especially those serving nobles, were often required to study basic astrology. Not in any formal capacity, this wasn't Hogwarts, but in the way a chef today might memorize food allergies. Oh, you're a Scorpio and Saturn's ascendant. We'll do a soft side part today and absolutely no curling near your temples. These stylists knew that one bad cut during a planetary conjunction could ruin a career or trigger a duel. Even more curious were the personal journals people kept about their grooming rituals. Some survive to this day. One particularly delightful entry from 1673 describes a woman in Vienna who tracked every braid, bun, and brushstroke alongside notes like moon fat and kind hair, obedient or comet smirked frizz, returned. These weren't just idle observations. They were acts of record-keeping for self-preservation's small attempts to decode the maddening algorithm of fate. Let's not forget the role of mirrors. Reflections were considered spiritually risky, especially during periods of celestial turbulence. One handbook warned, "Avoid gazing long into glass when Mars is raw, lest you see not your face, but your future broken." In other words, don't tempt the universe with vanity, or it might answer. So many people opted to brush their hair in low light or even blindfolded like a salon-themed trust fall. And yes, it got stranger. In certain regions, mostly rural and deeply traditional, people believed that brushing your hair during a meteor shower could cause your thoughts to leak out through the scalp. No one could explain the mechanism, of course, but it led to many sleepless nights under tightly wrapped headscarves. Children were especially protected. If a comet was spotted, mothers would often forbid hair brushing entirely, fearing that dreams might get combed away. There was also the fear of split ends of destiny, a phrase found in the marginalia of an astrology textbook from 1694. It implied that a bad trim done under an unlucky star could cause more than just ragged strands. It could cause a fork in your life path, sending you spiraling into poverty, scandal, or worse, social obscurity. So barbers started offering hair readings. They'd snip a small strand, observe its shape, thickness, and shine, and make predictions. "Ah, you have Saturn's shimmer. You'll be betrayed before the harvest." Or, "This curl speaks of travel. Pack light." Sometimes people left offerings before brushing their hair, little bowls of water, sprigs of rosemary, or coins wrapped in ribbon. These weren't prayers exactly, but transactions. A polite way of saying, "Please, O great and frizzy heavens, let me pass through this morning's grooming without incident." Because, let's face it, no one wants to start the day with a bad part and a worse omen. Ironically, the more elaborate these beliefs became, the more elaborate hairstyles grew. Towers of curls, powdered wigs, braided labyrinths, some reaching a foot in height. The more chaotic the sky, the more people tried to compensate with structure. If the cosmos wouldn't give you peace, at least your hair could hold itself together. Literally. With pins. Lots of pins. Academic circles, of course, began to take notice. A few early scientists tried to track any legitimate correlation between comet sightings and, well, hair behavior. One physician in London claimed he observed increased dryness of scalp and irritability of follicles following the 1682 comet. Others scoffed, attributing it to winter air or poor hygiene. But the debate gave rise to the first ever recorded phrase that may be translated as, "It's not science, it's scalpience." That physician was never invited back to the Royal Society. Still, the rituals persisted. They comforted people. They provided order in a world that often didn't. If combing westward during sunset made someone feel safe, who were you to argue? If brushing clockwise under starlight helped a girl believe her love would return from war, then maybe the universe did take notes after all. You're not even halfway through your nighttime stretch when your thoughts drift into stranger territory, a journal. Not just any journal, but one filled with detailed records of tangles, hair oils, and comet sightings. It belonged to a 17th-century astronomer, of course, because when you're busy charting the heavens, it only makes sense to chart your own hair's behavior too, right? Especially if you believe the state of your curls could reflect or even predict the mood of the cosmos. You flip through this imaginary leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and smelling faintly of wax and anxiety, and find a curious entry dated the 5th day of the comet's tail hair, unusually rebellious, spirits low, fringe points northeast. This wasn't satire. He meant every word. For many early astronomers, some respected scholars, others eccentric enthusiasts, keeping a personal record of both sky and scalp was perfectly logical. They weren't just mapping stars. They were mapping their lives around the stars. If Mars moved backward, they delayed appointments. If Venus glowed too bright, they applied more lavender oil. And if a comet scorched across the sky, they closed the curtains, sat quietly, and refused to touch their hair until the thing vanished. One famous observer, Dr. Leontius Habermal of Würzburg, compiled a 30-year diary that included astronomical charts alongside a color-coded system for hair integrity. His notes used terms like celestial cooperation, comb resistance, and my personal favorite, sorrowful fuzz. On nights when he spotted comet activity, he would chart a correlation between tail position and curl pattern. There were even graphs. The man essentially invented cosmic hair analytics, and he wasn't alone. In London, a small but vocal circle of comet groomers emerged, men and women who believed in proactive scalp management during cosmic events. They met in tea houses, exchanged recipes for comet-safe conditioners, honey and camphor oil being a top choice, and even practiced synchronized brushing during meteor showers. You can almost imagine them in powdered wigs, politely arguing over whether to brush north to south or follow the elliptical path of Halley's latest appearance. One pamphlet from 1680 titled Of Tales and Tangles, The Hair's Role in Celestial Harmony, encouraged readers to observe thy strands daily, for they shall whisper to thee of heavenly moods. Printed in shaky Gothic script with star motifs in the margins, it instructed people to avoid trimming their hair if Jupiter appeared to blink, to always comb before moonrise, and to tie back loose locks when thunder was distant. The idea was that hair acted like a personal antenna to the sky. If it bristled something up, there was brewing. There's something oddly soothing about this belief, this notion that the vast unknowable universe was somehow intimately connected to your scalp, that the world wasn't indifferent but watching, that the gentle bend of your hair was in some mysterious way a message. Even the tools of the trade took on symbolic meaning. Combs made of silver were believed to deflect planetary aggression. Copper ones invited Venusian charm. Brushes with bristles from white boars were said to ensure clarity during Mercury's retrograde. If you were truly devout, you had an entire grooming kit arranged like a shrine. One box recovered from a Bavarian estate contained a moon-shaped mirror, a sun-engraved comb, and a scroll warning not to speak while brushing under a waning crescent. It gets even better. Some astronomers began including hair observations in their official reports. Observed comet of medium tail-length pale gold in hue, one wrote, accompanied by erratic scalp static and unusual parting of fringe. Another noted Saturn ascendant. Colleagues' curls did coil with unnatural glee. Suspect interference. Whether they did this in earnest or with a twinkle in their eye is hard to say, but the records exist. Whole pages dedicated to the eerie feeling that the sky might just be tweaking your follicles for fun. Let's pause to appreciate the artistry of these individuals, the ones who looked through telescopes by night and mirrors by morning, who treated their hair as not just vanity, but as a barometer of the stars. And maybe in doing so, they offered a quieter kind of science, one not built on equations, but on observation routine and the gentle hope that if you just brushed carefully enough, the universe might go easy on you. Modern historians now debate whether these grooming journals were legitimate scientific tools or quirky personal side projects. Were they meant to support larger cosmological theories? Or were they simply the coping mechanisms of people trying to maintain control in a world full of plague war and unpredictable comets? The answer might be both. After all, even the most rational minds need rituals. And what's more ritualistic than taming a lock of hair at dawn? Think, too, of how this transformed relationships. Lovers sent locks of hair not just as keepsakes, but as cosmological tokens. This curl was snipped under Mars's full gaze, a note might read, "Wear it for strength." Or a strand taken during Venus' brightest night? For tenderness. The strands were pressed into letters sealed with wax and carried like tiny galaxies of meaning. Romantic, absolutely. Hygienic, less so. But in a world where the stars ruled everything, love and astronomy often shared a pillow. Some stylists even began calling themselves celestial sculptors. They'd arrive at a noble's home telescope, in one hand, scissors in the other, and ask questions like, "Do you wish to align with Mercury today?" Or perhaps attract some Jupiter confidence, hairstyles were tailored to planetary mood boards. A soft spiral for lunar harmony, a sharp fringe for Saturn defiance, a center part for neutrality in romantic entanglements. It was astrology therapy and fashion all in one unusually fragrant session. And of course, there were the skeptics. A mathematician from Florence once wrote a scathing satire titled A Treatise on Hair and Heavenly Delusions, in which he compared hair astrology to measuring rain by licking your thumb. Naturally, his hair fell out mysteriously the next year. Coincidence? Or karmic split ends? So, tonight, as you lie in bed, with your hair doing its own quiet gravity dance against the pillow, think of those journals, the careful notations, the little wax seals beside charts of frizz and stars, the belief that somewhere in the tangled mess of the universe and your morning cowlick meaning waited to be found. By now, you've accepted that comets once held sway over curls that barbers charted constellations, and that even the most educated minds of the 17th century left room in their diaries for notes on fringe behavior. But let's go further into a town where the hysteria surrounding a comet became so intense the entire population made a collective decision everyone would change their hairstyle to avoid disaster. It began with a few rumors. A baker claimed his sourdough refused to rise the morning after he spotted a glowing tail in the sky. A school teacher's canary started singing backward. A young girl's ringlets turned straight overnight. Coincidence? The townspeople didn't think so. They believed the comet had cursed them, and their hair was the first to suffer. In response, the town's elders, half politicians, half enthusiastic amateur astrologers, called an emergency meeting in the town square. They gathered under a banner hastily painted with stars and combs and declared, "If the heavens strike our hair, then we shall strike back with scissors." And so began what would later be known in the village chronicles as the Great Hair Reform of 1671. The decree was simple, yet outrageous. Everyone, regardless of age rank or follicle health, had to adopt a new hairstyle within 3 days. The logic, if the comet had identified their town by their existing hairdos, a complete makeover would confuse it. Think of it as cosmic camouflage. If the universe was going to send misfortune, They'd meet it with freshly trimmed bangs and defiant pompadours. The town's barbers were both horrified and thrilled. Business boomed. Lines formed down cobblestone streets as people clutched crude drawings of new styles. Mothers dragged reluctant children. Husbands argued with wives over acceptable levels of curl. There were tears, mishaps, and one gentleman who fainted when asked to part his hair on the other side. But the left side is where I store my dignity. He cried before being gently ushered into a chair and sheared with compassion. Some styles were elegant, even daring. One older woman, known for her knee-length braid, emerged with a braided crown resembling Saturn's rings. A group of farmers shaved star patterns into the backs of their heads, hoping to align with the comet's tail and ride it like a blessing. Children began wearing their hair in literal pigtails, 2 small buns wrapped in cloth and tied with silver string. It wasn't just fashion, it was survival. There were, of course, disasters. The town cobbler, in an effort to create a meteor-inspired flare, accidentally burned off half his mustache with a candle. The blacksmith attempted a molten curling iron prototype that left 3 men scorched and 1 sheep mysteriously curly. But spirits remained high. The comet was still in the sky, but no one had reported any further hair tragedies. In fact, a few villagers claimed their complexions had improved, their split ends had vanished, and one man insisted his stutter was cured by his new mullet. Science, maybe not. Confidence, absolutely. This shared experience forged a bizarre unity. People complimented each other's brave new looks in the market. Strangers nodded in solidarity, bonded not by class or kinship, but by fringe. The town even held a parade, the Comet Cotillion, they called it. Everyone marched through the square under banners made of old hair clippings, tossing lavender petals and singing a tune called Brush Against the Sky. A comet effigy, complete with a flaming yarn tail, was ceremoniously dunked into the river, followed by cheers and one fainting goat. By week's end, the comet disappeared. Life slowly returned to normal, or what passed for it, in a town that had collectively styled itself into celestial anonymity. But the hairstyles remained. People liked their new looks. Even the baker admitted his sourdough seemed happier. A few skeptics suggested it had more to do with warmer ovens and less panic, but they were ignored. The official town narrative, recorded in ink and hair dye on the village ledger, declared, "We tricked the stars with scissors." Interestingly, this event drew attention from nearby towns, and not all of it was friendly. Some accused the villagers of witchcraft, suggesting that only dark forces could prompt so many people to change their hair at once. Others sent envoys to study their grooming methods. A delegation from a neighboring city reportedly asked, was there a specific conditioner involved? The villagers declined to share. But beyond the comedy and confusion, the great hair reform of 1671 became a case study in communal psychology. Historians now look at it as a rare moment where fear catalyzed not division, but creativity. Faced with the unknown, the townspeople didn't build walls or hide indoors. They reached for their brushes, their scissors, and their boldest ideas. It wasn't about vanity. It was about reclaiming control over something, anything, in a world that often offered none. There's a lesson here buried in all the absurdity. When faced with uncertainty, humans reach for ritual reinvention and sometimes bangs. We laugh at it now, but don't we still do the same? New job, new haircut, breakup, dye it red, midlife crisis. Shave it all and buy a telescope. The tools change. The instinct doesn't. So the next time your hair won't cooperate or the universe seems to be aiming its chaos directly at your scalp, remember that one little village long ago looked up at a comet and said, "Fine, let's meet madness with moose." Now that the townsfolk have survived their collective hair identity crisis, let's step into a smaller, quieter corner of that same world, a single barbershop nestled between a dusty bookbinder's and a bakery that always smells slightly of cinnamon and regret. This barber, unlike the flamboyant cosmic stylists of the courts, doesn't care for stardust-infused oils or lunar-aligned trims. His name is Master Elric, and he is a practical man, or at least he used to be. That is until the day a comet appeared above his village and he was suddenly asked to interpret the will of the stars through the angle of a widow's bangs. It started innocently. A noblewoman from a nearby estate came in trembling and asked whether it was safe to shorten her fringe, not because of fashion, but because she had seen a streak of silver in the sky the night before and feared the consequences. "It pointed directly at my parlor," she whispered, as though the comet had selected her personally. Elric, who usually reserved his commentary for split ends and beard-trimming techniques, found himself mumbling something about Saturn's passive mood and the calming effects of frankincense shampoo. She wept with relief and tipped him generously. Thus began his unintended career as a hair prophet. Word spread. Soon his humble shop became a place of pilgrimage. Farmers arrived asking for protection trims. Scholars wanted intellect-enhancing layers. A local baker requested a cut that might deflect Mercury's retrograde. One man even asked if Elric could snip away the influence of his mother-in-law, though that required more than scissors. With each new request, Elric improvised. He began reading books on astrology, then blending what he read with what he already knew: the tilt of the scalp, the grain of the hair, and the way a person flinched when they heard thunder. He developed his own system, a combination of star charts and scalp tension readings, cross-referenced with the angle of morning light through his front window. It was part science, part guesswork, and entirely sincere. Because whether or not he believed in the comet's wrath, his clients did, and belief, he found, was half the cure. To accommodate the shift in services, he redecorated. The usual shaving posters were replaced with illustrations of celestial bodies. He began offering teas brewed with follicle-calming herbs and installed a small hourglass labeled Comet Buffer Period, during which no trims were allowed if a celestial body had passed within the last 72 hours. His waiting room filled with hushed voices and hopeful sighs. Haircuts became ceremonies. Elric kept a log of every customer date, time, hairstyle, and current celestial activity. He noted how certain styles seemed to fare better under Venus than Mars, and how Saturn, when in opposition, made even the best curls turn limp. He didn't advertise these conclusions. He just watched and cut and learned. Eventually, other barbers began visiting him, hoping to learn the method. Some respected him. Others mocked. A few copied his techniques, but swapped the star charts for rune stones or planetary incense. Elric didn't mind. He was too busy recalibrating his cutting shears according to lunar phases. Of course not everyone believed. One evening, A young skeptic marched into the shop demanding a normal trim without all the astrology nonsense. Elric nodded, said nothing, and gave him the neatest, most mathematically precise haircut of his career. The man left satisfied. But the next day a pigeon pooped directly on his new parting. He returned a week later for a more Jupiter-aligned look. Elric's growing reputation brought requests from higher circles. A duke's daughter came seeking a look that would confuse Mars but delight Neptune. A playwright wanted his beard shaped like Orion's belt. A widow asked for a cut that would let the heavens know she was ready to move on. Elric did his best, trimming carefully, always listening, always observing the silent way people pinned their hopes to their hair and to him. But the true turning point came during a particularly long comet season when people stopped asking for styles altogether. They came instead with questions. Will my child recover? Can I find love again? Is this the year I open my bakery? And always Elric would tilt their head slightly toward the light, run his fingers along the scalp, and offer a trim that somehow made them feel braver. The cut itself wasn't magic, but the moment shared, quiet, intentional was. He never called himself a seer. He never claimed to read the future, but he understood perhaps better than anyone that the act of grooming had become a ritual, a declaration, a way of saying, I still have control over this one small thing, even when everything else is chaos. And that, for many, was enough. Over time, Elric's methods faded from fashion. New trends emerged, planets lost their influence, and the comet hysteria gave way to powdered wigs and revolution. But in a dusty corner of history, his journals remain a record not just of haircuts, but of hopes, of people reaching for certainty with scissors in hand, and of one man who listened when they did. You've followed comets across town squares, into salons, and through the anxious pages of astronomers' journals. But now you're about to enter a forgotten attic, filled with curling dust velvet boxes and something unexpectedly precious, a stack of almanacs. Just any almanacs, mind you. These were the hair calendars of yesteryear. Delicately stitched covers, yellowing parchment, and titles like The Monthly Mane and Moon Guide or Locks and Lunations, a lady's lunar lookbook. These were once considered household essentials, sitting proudly on dressers beside jars of clove oil and pins shaped like stars. And you settled under your blanket, one eye half-lidded, are about to flip through their pages. The concept was charming in its absurdity. Each page listed not only moon phases and celestial movements, but also included entries like best days for side parts avoid braiding, during Saturn shifts and top lucky hours, for beard maintenance. Some editions were illustrated with flowy-haired figures pointing upward, their curls aligned with constellations like Aries or Pisces. There were lucky styles for weddings, moon-swept curls, funeral-appropriate fringes, soft mourning bangs, and recommended trims for peace treaties, even necklines. If you could wear your politics in your parting, these books would teach you how. Published mostly by semi-anonymous astrologer hairdressers, these calendars reflected a specific kind of logic. If the moon moves oceans, surely it can tweak your cowlick. If Venus rules love, then a Venus evening is obviously best for flirtatious ringlets. And if Mercury is in retrograde, well, you don't just avoid sending letters. You avoid the barbershop altogether. The most famous of these was The Harmonious Head a Year of Lunar Styling, published in 1683 by someone known only as M.D., who may have been either a midwife or a wig maker, or both. Her almanac included a fold-out scalp wheel, which showed which planetary hours corresponded with which combing techniques. Rotate the wheel to match your birth hour with the comet of the season, and voila, your hair fate revealed. Scholars still argue whether the predictions were based on any real celestial data, or if MD was simply a genius at branding. Either way, it sold out annually for a decade. These books became staples in households both noble and modest. Mothers used them to decide when to trim their children's curls, often making haircuts into little ceremonies. There were even bedtime rhymes to help children remember brush not when Mars does glare. His gaze will leave your scalp bare. Charming, terrifying, and possibly effective, if only because no child dared defy such vivid warnings. Hair salons are what passed for them in tavern corners, and candlelit back rooms often displayed torn-out pages from these almanacs. Some even offered discounts for customers who booked during ideal lunar slots. You could hear the phrase, "I'm getting a waxing crescent fringe today," said with complete seriousness. Stylists were part scientist, part timekeeper, and part magician. Their tools weren't just scissors and combs, but calendars, star charts, and sometimes pendulums, just to double-check the vibe. Naturally, these guides weren't just about avoiding bad luck. They were also aspirational. Want to be taken seriously at court trim under Jupiter? Want romance brush under Venus? Want to disappear quietly from social obligation, cut under a waning moon while facing west? There was a ritual for every need, a symbolic snip for every desire. And though results varied wildly, belief was consistent. Curiously, these calendars sometimes included weather predictions based on hairstyle outcomes. Expect strong winds if fringes lift, unbidden one warned. Another claimed that tangled braids predicted stormy travel. It was meteorology via Maine, and no less scientific than many other 17th century methods. Some even argued that split ends correlated with early frost. The aristocracy had their own editions bound in leather and embossed with gilded stars. These deluxe versions offered month-by-month hair strategies based on social calendars. For example, February's advice might read, "For soiree, sweep thy locks in Libra's gentle curve." But beware, Neptune's jealousy leads to flatness at the root. These weren't merely practical tips, they were cosmic etiquette, and if your fringe drooped during Saturn's glare, you risked not just embarrassment, but celestial discourtesy. Despite their popularity, not everyone trusted the calendars. A few skeptical voices questioned why lunar alignment seemed to favor those with thicker hair and better mirrors. Some whispered that the charts were rigged by wig makers to boost sales. Others insisted that true hair harmony could only be achieved by consulting one's personal star map. Still, even the skeptics were often seen secretly glancing at a page before running a comb through their locks. And like all trends, the craze began to fade. By the early 18th century, wigs had overtaken natural hair as the primary canvas of fashion. Hair calendars lost their relevance as predictability took precedence over planetary experimentation. But the legacy lingered. Some customs, like trimming on the waxing moon for growth, persist even today, whispered in beauty salons by stylists who don't believe in that stuff. But just in case. Now, as you lie in bed with your own hair, probably somewhere between Saturn-inspired and pillow-mashed, Consider this: for over a century, people believed the sky had opinions on their grooming choices, that each brushstroke might ripple outward into fate. It may sound silly, but maybe there's something sweet about it too, that quiet trust that the stars were paying attention even to the little things, like whether your bangs looked nice. You're deep enough into this cosmic hair journey now that it's only fair to ask, were comets really to blame? Or were people just covering for bad choices, literally and figuratively? Tonight, we brush gently against the first academic debates on the matter. Because yes, somewhere between the wig powder and the moon charts, a few brave souls dared to whisper, what if the problem isn't the comet? What if it's the oil? And with that, a controversy as tangled as an overbrushed ponytail began to unravel. You see, the 17th century was no stranger to questionable beauty products. Most hair oils, tonics, and creams were homemade or sold by someone claiming to be apprenticed under Venus herself. Common ingredients included goose fat, rosemary, wine soot, and occasionally blessed rainwater collected during equinoxes. Not the worst ideas until someone tried mixing whale grease with mercury to lock in lunar essence. That poor fellow glowed in the dark for 2 weeks. Allegedly, as comets became the scapegoats for everything from crop failure to spontaneous bald spots, a few quietly skeptical minds began to question the cause and effect logic. Why did only certain people experience hair catastrophe during celestial events? Why did others report no frizz at all, even while Mars and Jupiter were dancing an angry duet in the sky? Was there another variable, perhaps? Something more terrestrial? One of the first documented critics was Dr. Theobald Albrecht, a physician and part-time wig consultant from Frankfurt. He published a slim treatise titled Of Vapors and Vanity, a refutation of cometary cosmetology, in which he argued that poor hygiene, not planetary anger, caused hair degradation. He proposed a radical idea, maybe sleeping in a powdered wig for 5 nights in a row during a thunderstorm had more to do with split ends than Saturn. Unsurprisingly, the response was mixed. Some applauded his common sense. Others accused him of heresy and poor grooming. The Royal Guild of Celestial Stylists. Yes, that was a thing called his theories, dangerous nonsense, and warned the public not to trust anyone who didn't offer at least one moon phase before trimming bangs. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. More scholars joined the fray. A Scottish apothecary began testing the pH of various oils used during comet seasons. An Italian herbalist charted which ingredients caused the most rapid hair loss. Her findings, overuse of nettle oil during retrograde, resulted in hair behaviors resembling rebellious moss. Very scientific. The debate soon expanded beyond ingredients and into cultural interpretation. Was the comet really a celestial villain, or had it simply been used to cover up poor decisions, a disastrous perm, a spontaneous trim with dull shears, a failed dye job involving crushed beetles and copper flakes? In such cases, blaming a comet was far more dignified than admitting personal error. The stars betrayed me sounded nobler than I used too much lard and fell asleep on a heat stone. The most entertaining rebuttal came in the form of satire. A playwright in Prague penned a farce called The Tale's End, in which an entire town slowly loses their hair not because of a comet, but because of a traveling salesman peddling cosmic tonic. The play ends with the townspeople chasing the scammer out, while still insisting the stars must be involved. My hair may be gone, cries one character, but my denial remains lush and full. Even among believers, the cracks began to show. A noblewoman in Vienna wrote a letter now archived in brittle parchment, admitting she had used the comet as an excuse to change her hairstyle after a social snub. It was easier, she wrote, to say the heavens demanded change than admit Lady Brunhilde called my bun provincial. Scholars now cite this as one of the earliest known cases of astro-cosmetic deflection. And yet, despite the emerging skepticism belief in comet-related grooming, chaos didn't vanish. It simply evolved. The conversation shifted from comets cause hair disasters to comets influence the energy around grooming, a softer claim. Vague, harder to disprove, perfect for the age of powdered rationalism. The result: people still checked the skies, still lit comet candles, still whispered to their brushes before trimming, but they also started reading labels on their oils and brushing in well-ventilated rooms. This strange balance of belief and inquiry led to a new genre of writing the hair care pamphlet with scientific flavor. Titles like Starlight and Sebum, A Gentleman's Guide to Root Management, and Frizz Folklore and Fact filled shelves. They offered grooming advice alongside planetary charts, hedging bets between logic and lore. A typical sentence might read, "Apply sparingly under waning light, though mercury salts remain a risk, even without Uranian gaze." And while all this might sound like satire now, it mirrored a larger shift in society: the slow move from superstition toward science. People were learning to ask better questions, to challenge inherited rituals, to suspect that maybe not everything in their lives was controlled by glowing balls of gas millions of miles away. Maybe their hair was just hair. But even now, lying in your bed, with your head nestled into the pillow's soft dip, you can't help but smile at the idea. Wouldn't it be nice if the universe cared about your hair that much? If a comet's passing wasn't just astrophysics, but a little celestial nudge to refresh your look. A reminder that transformation is part of the cosmos. And maybe that failed fringe wasn't a mistake. It was written in the stars. Tonight, your mind drifts toward royalty, specifically one unfortunate king whose crown didn't just slip but slid entirely off his head during a public appearance. Not due to treason, not even due to scandal. No, the culprit, according to court gossip, was a comet, or more precisely, the unholy frizz that the comet allegedly summoned upon His Majesty's otherwise glorious curls. You sink deeper into your blanket as the story unfolds, equal parts political embarrassment and celestial comedy, with a touch of powdered regret. Our tale begins in the spring of 1685, during the Comet of Kertsch's long shimmering reign in the sky. King Ferdinando IV, known less for his policies and more for his extravagant wigs and personal mirror collection, was preparing to address his people from the balcony of his palace. The event was to mark the royal endorsement of a new calendar, one that ironically promised to standardize comet-related predictions. As nobles gathered in the square below, feathers bobbing and fans fluttering, the king stood behind the curtain, dabbing his forehead and checking his hairline for the third time. His wigmaker, a nervous man named Bellamy, had worked all night ensuring the royal coif resembled a thundercloud tamed by divine will. Layer upon layer of powdered horsehair had been teased, curled, and fluffed to perfection. Or so they thought. Because when the king stepped onto the balcony, raised his arm for silence, and took in the sight of his loyal subjects, something shifted. Perhaps it was the breeze. Perhaps it was the subtle swelling of humidity. Perhaps it was the fact that above the crowd the comet glared down like a judgmental streak of sky fire. But the wig moved. First a gentle tilt, then a dramatic lift. Then in front of thousands the entire royal crown wig combo sailed backward off his head like a startled raccoon abandoning a garbage can. A collective gasp rippled through the square. Some clutched their pearls. Others looked skyward as though the heavens had just yanked the monarchy down by the roots. The king, stunned, stood bald and blinking, while Bellamy sprinted forward in a flurry of satin and shame, chasing the airborne hairpiece as it rolled toward a fountain. And what did the royal court do in the days that followed? They blamed the comet, not just for the wind, but for the disgrace. Royal astrologers convened an emergency council and concluded that the celestial tail had interfered with the static balance of powdered wigs. Its arc, one astrologer wrote, pointed directly at the dome of the palace, a clear signal. The stars sought humility. To save face, royal artists were ordered to repaint recent portraits, softening the wig's volume and adding subtle star motifs to indicate that the king had been in dialogue with the cosmos. A public statement declared that the event had been a sign of divine realignment and that the king's newly exposed scalp represented transparency and unity with the people. Not everyone bought it, but few dared argue. Behind palace doors, though, it was chaos. Wig makers were interrogated. Wind direction charts were recalculated. A short-lived law was passed requiring all royal wigs to be anchored with 3 divine pins and a moon braid, though no one could quite define what that meant. Bellamy, for his part, was demoted to beard maintenance, a position with less altitude-related risk. But the story didn't die. Across Europe, caricatures appeared depicting kings with parachuting hair. Pamphlets mocked the sovereign who lost to a streak of light. Children rhymed, "If your locks are bold, beware the cold, for comets come and crowns unfold." It wasn't just gossip, it became cultural shorthand for losing control at the worst moment. To this day, some historians refer to political blunders as comet moments, even if no stars are involved. The real curiosity, though, was how the incident redefined the public's relationship with appearance and power. People began to ask if even a king's hair could betray him. Who among us is safe? This spawned a wave of humbler hairstyles among the middle class. Hair was worn lower, tighter, and more natural. Some whispered that the stars favored simplicity, and merchants began marketing comet-safe grooming kits made of modest woods and herbal waxes. One ad read, "Defy the tail with time and tact." Philosophers joined the conversation. A French essayist mused that the comet had done more to humble monarchy than any rebellion. A German poet wrote that no crown sits secure when vanity flies higher than faith. Even within royal circles, the event sparked uneasy questions about symbolism and fate. Was hair merely fashion, or was it a message board for the heavens? A tufted warning system draped over our softest vulnerabilities. King Ferdinando, to his credit, leaned into the embarrassment. After several weeks, he appeared in public with a much simpler hairstyle, short-combed back, still powdered, but no longer architectural. He addressed the crowd with a smile and quipped, "Let us all wear our crowns on the inside from now on." The audience roared with laughter. It was perhaps the moment he became a better ruler, not because he looked the part, but because he stopped pretending the part was untouchable. Even today, There's a small museum room in the palace tucked between the Royal Cloak Archive and a hallway of discontinued teaspoons that displays the original wig. It's preserved under glass, mounted at a jaunty angle and captioned simply, "Fell by Comet's will." Some visitors laugh, some nod solemnly, and every once in a while someone whispers, "I had a day like that once." Tonight, we walk into a place where scissors glint like tiny crescent moons, and astrology charts are pinned beside curling irons. The Royal Hair Academy, a little-known but very real institution that briefly flourished during the height of celestial hair panic. Established under the reign of Queen Clarimond II, whose bouffant was widely believed to function as an emotional barometer, the Academy's goal was bold, some might say ridiculous, to train stylists in both the art of hairdressing and the science of the stars. If your barber didn't know Mars was in opposition during your appointment, they simply weren't qualified. Located in a gilded annex behind the palace's greenhouse, the Royal Hair Academy wasn't open to the public. Entry required a letter of recommendation, an interview conducted under candlelight, and a short essay on the influence of Neptune on split ends. Successful applicants were given matching smocks embroidered with constellations and a toolkit that included scissors, brushes, curling rods, and a miniature orrery that squeaked when Saturn made its rotation. The curriculum was by all accounts absurdly specific. Students studied the 12 houses of hair from the house of volume, governing fluff and lift, to the house of frizz governing misfortune. Lessons covered how to perform safe trims under lunar eclipses, how to style during solar conjunctions, and how to deflect bad luck using mirror angles and rosemary incense. Exams were both theoretical and practical. Demonstrate a retrograde safe bun while explaining the myth of Cassiopeia's comb. One student's diary, now preserved in a dusty library vault, reads like a cross between a hair salon manual and a medieval prophecy. Today, Master Elgin taught us the 3 braids of fate, she wrote. When done under a waxing crescent, they promise clarity of thought. Under a waning moon, they fray one's luck. Anna attempted it during Mercury's reversal. She now speaks only in rhymes. Was she joking? Possibly. But these journals are full of such tales, foiled curls during meteor showers, prophetic cowlicks and buns that unwound during full moons, and revealed secrets never meant to be known. The Academy's founder, Dame Celestina Volure, was herself a strange figure, part scientist, part mystic, part celebrity. She claimed her family had once brushed a comet's tail from their rooftop and been blessed with generations of glossy hair. Whether this was true or not, her lectures were packed. Her most famous demonstration involved trimming a noblewoman's bangs during a meteor shower while blindfolded, guided only by planetary position and the whispers of Venus in the room. The result, a fringe that remained unruffled for 13 days straight. Students wept, applauded. One fainted into a bowl of pomade. But beyond the spectacle, there was genuine craftsmanship. Stylists left the Academy knowing how to calm a panicked bride during a lunar eclipse, how to conceal a scandalous love affair in a clever braid, and how to read a man's ambition in the tilt of his sideburns. They were part confidant, part cartographer, drawing private maps across the scalp with every careful touch. Graduates were in high demand. Nobles fought over booking appointments with stellar stylists. Some offered dowries just to secure a personal hair astrologer. Even rival courts began to copy the model. One king in the north reportedly constructed an entire salon observatory complete with a rotating ceiling chart and a stylist's chair that aligned with the pole star. It didn't improve his hair much, but his enemies reported mysterious bouts of envy nonetheless. Critics naturally were vocal. A prominent philosopher called the Academy a shrine to nonsense wrapped in lavender oil. A bishop warned that aligning haircuts with planets risked inviting ungodly energies through the follicles. But despite these objections, the school thrived for nearly 2 decades. Its graduates kept journals that today provide historians with some of the most unintentionally hilarious insights into 17th century anxiety. One entry reads, "Client wished for courage, aligned her curls with Mars. Later, she eloped with her fencing tutor. Success. Not all outcomes were glamorous. There were mishaps, too. A student once confused Jupiter's house with Saturn's and gave a prince a haircut so lopsided it started a rumor about a secret illness. Another clipped a duchess's fringe during an inauspicious lunar alignment, and the resulting style resembled a wilted sea anemone. The duchess wore a veil for 4 months and reportedly cursed the stars in 4 languages. Eventually, the tides of fashion shifted. Wigs grew taller, more elaborate, and less reliant on natural hair, making planetary precision less urgent. The Royal Hair Academy closed its doors quietly one spring, its final class dismissed with a note that simply read, "May your strands find symmetry in the stars." The building was later converted into a storage space for ceremonial umbrellas and forgotten violas. And yet, even today, echoes remain. Some beauty schools still teach planetary-friendly timing. A few salons offer lunar-based booking slots. And occasionally, someone online will post a chart advising you when to dye your roots based on the position of Venus. Laugh if you must, but isn't there something lovely about it? The idea that your hair could be part of something cosmic, that your curls and partings aren't just style but signal. As you drift deeper into the quiet folds of the night, let's turn our gaze skyward, but only partially. Tonight, we're not looking up with awe, but with caution. For in this chapter of our tangled tale, we explore one of the stranger fears that haunted the grooming habits of centuries past, the dreaded act of brushing one's hair during an eclipse, not a partial one, not the shy kind that peeks through clouds. No, we're talking about a full, solemn, soul-snatching eclipse when the sun disappears in broad daylight and everyone suddenly remembers they forgot to feed the chickens. It wasn't just an astronomical event, it was an omen, and brushing your hair during it, practically asking for trouble. The belief was simple: if the sun and moon could momentarily erase each other, what hope did your scalp have? Folk traditions across Europe, particularly in the Alpine regions and scattered parts of Eastern Europe, carried firm warnings. Do not comb when the sky frowns, one proverb advised. The hand that touches hair under a stolen sun invites the loss of something dear. A bit vague, sure, but terrifying enough to send whole villages into frantic pre-eclipse preparation. Brushes were hidden, mirrors were turned to face the wall, and mothers wrapped their children's heads in scarves tied so tight they left little crescent-shaped marks for days. One surviving account from 1691 describes a woman in what is now Hungary who accidentally began brushing her hair as the sky darkened. A neighbor screamed, snatched the brush from her hand, and began sprinkling salt in every corner of the room. The woman, confused and slightly tangled, was later given an emergency head washing in vinegar and prayer water. She lived, of course, but her bangs never quite lay straight again. People whispered that the eclipse had bent her parting. Spiritually, it wasn't just about aesthetics. Hair in many traditions was believed to store spiritual energy. To brush it during an eclipse when celestial balance itself had gone askew was seen as a way to disturb your fate. The logic went something like this: during an eclipse, the normal order of the heavens is disrupted. The sun hides, the moon dares to block it, shadows fall in strange places. And anything done during that time, cutting, brushing, braiding, was thought to imprint that disruption into your being, like weaving a knot you couldn't untangle. This belief extended even to the wealthy, who were often more superstitious than their peasants, just with better tools. In one French court, an eclipse day meant postponing all scheduled grooming. Even the Queen's hairstylist, a man named Le Clémence, famous for inventing the solar swoop, refused to touch a single strand until the light returned. He wore gloves, kept his tools sealed in a velvet box, and insisted that the sky be visibly calm before he would uncork the rosewater. Other royal courts went even further. In Spain, a full eclipse triggered a follicular fast. No one could wash, brush powder, or pin their hair for 24 hours. Wigs were allowed, but only if pre-styled during clear sun. At one point, this rule was so ingrained that an eclipse near Madrid delayed an entire diplomatic meeting by 2 days, simply because the ambassador's hairpiece had lost its volume and no one dared touch it until the sun had proven itself trustworthy again. Monks and mystics, ever fond of omens, took this idea to philosophical extremes. One monk in Bologna theorized that the eclipse effect caused thoughts to swirl downward through the hair and out the tips. He warned against combing unless you wish to forget your purpose and weep for no reason. Another scholar wrote that brushing under an eclipse caused the shadowing of self, in which one might live for years with hair that grew against the grain of destiny. His pamphlet was not widely read, but it remains delightfully dramatic. Naturally, some took advantage of the fear. Traveling salesmen began marketing eclipse-safe combs made of amber and carved with lunar runes. Were they magical? Probably not. Did they sell? Absolutely. One street vendor was said to shout, "Block the moon, not your shine," as he peddled brushes from a cart shaped like a smiling sun. Irony, perhaps, but with flair. As with most superstitions, there were exceptions. Some rebel stylists embraced the eclipse, calling it the perfect time to reframe your fate. They offered secret appointments in candlelit rooms, trimming locks, while chanting softly about transformation and shadow. Their clients were often artists, poets, or people going through a very complicated breakup. One customer described the experience as mystical and slightly itchy. Another claimed her hair grew in silver streaks after an eclipse trim and insisted it made her a better violinist. Science notably remained silent on that point. The fear also found its way into bedtime routines. Parents warned children not to brush their dolls' hair during an eclipse, lest the dolls come alive under moon-blind eyes. A particularly strange tale from Prague tells of a doll that blinked once after being brushed during the darkest part of an eclipse and was never touched again. It now resides in a museum where no one talks too loudly near its case. But over time, reason began to reclaim the sky. By the late 18th century, public education campaigns sponsored by astronomers and very brave barbers tried to dispel the myth. Pamphlets explained that eclipses were natural, that brushing was safe, and that no hair held a soul vulnerable to lunar mischief. Still, the stigma lingered. Many simply preferred not to risk it. After all, would you really want to face an awkward cowlick and cosmic uncertainty on the same afternoon? And maybe that's the heart of it. The eclipse didn't just blot out the sun, it blotted out certainty. And in that darkness, people grabbed onto whatever they could. For some, it was salt. For others, a wig pinned down tight. And for a rare few, it was a belief that something as simple as a hairbrush could defy the sky or invite its wrath. By now, you've tiptoed through wig parades, comet excuses, and mirror-averse monks. But tonight's chapter crackles with something stranger still, a town that believed meteors, not just comets, were responsible for hair loss. Not metaphorically, literally. Falling stars to them meant falling follicles. And what began as a passing observation turned into a full-blown epidemic of scalp suspicion that left people covering their heads with such fervor you'd think the sky itself had grown teeth. Welcome to the town of Austerfeld, nestled in a quiet valley that, unfortunately for its reputation, was directly beneath one of the most active meteor paths in Central Europe. In 1698, a meteor shower of unusual brightness streaked across the night sky, accompanied by thunderous sound and a dazzling display that frightened livestock and inspired poetry. The next morning, a local miller discovered that his beard had developed a peculiar bald stripe, clean, sudden, and inexplicable. Naturally, he blamed the sky. Word spread. The village apothecary noticed several customers complaining of itchy scalps and sudden thinning. A baker swore that her husband's mustache had shortened in his sleep. And by the end of the week, nearly a dozen residents had reported celestial shedding. People started connecting dots that probably shouldn't have been connected: the brightness of the meteor, the direction of its trail, and the timing of their last shampoo. Soon, it was declared official by the village council: meteors cause hair to vanish. Theories blossomed like dandruff in the dry weather. One school teacher proposed that the stars emitted combusting particles of follicular negation. A shepherd claimed that the flash created a sound wave that rattled the roots loose. A particularly imaginative widow suggested that the meteor's tail functioned as a celestial vacuum, sucking up whatever wasn't firmly pinned down. She began sleeping with a stack of flat stones on her head for anchoring. To avoid the so-called meteor molt, villagers devised protective rituals. Hats were worn indoors. Hair was braided so tightly that people developed headaches and, ironically, temporary hairline damage. Buckets were worn on heads by night, not for fashion, but as celestial helmets. And children were taught a bedtime rhyme: when stars do fall and skies do moan, keep your curls and stay at home. Merchants, always quick to seize a trend, arrived with promises of meteor-proof treatments. One vendor sold sky balm, which turned out to be pig fat mixed with soot and the faint aroma of regret. Another offered enchanted combs carved from trees struck by lightning, marketed as naturally aligned with the upper spheres. People lined up desperate to preserve their strands. But the most astonishing twist came when a traveling doctor, Dr. Emmerich Halberd, a man equal parts physician and storyteller, declared he had proof of the phenomenon. He arrived in town with a trunk full of papers and a solemn expression, claiming to have treated dozens across the continent for meteor-induced alopecia. He gave lectures in the tavern pointing to crude sketches of stars and scalps, insisting that the energy released during a meteor's passage disrupted the cranial humors that nourished hair. He sold potions, gave consultations, handed out velvet-lined bonnets to the wealthy, and for a while he was revered as a genius. That is, until someone realized all of his patients had been paying customers from villages that didn't even appear on maps. When pressed for evidence, he packed his trunk and vanished during, of course, a meteor shower. The townspeople took this not as a sign of fraud, but as proof that the sky had reclaimed him. Still, belief doesn't crumble easily. Osterfeld leaned harder into prevention. They crafted a meteor watch bell rung by a designated lookout any time a streak appeared in the heavens. People would then scramble to throw scarves over their heads or dive into root cellars. One diary entry from a local girl reads, "Tonight, the sky split again. I dared not untie my braid. Mama says my hair dreams are safest when wrapped tight." It's unclear what hair dreams are, but they sound both magical and exhausting. Eventually, scientists, real ones, arrived to investigate. They brought charts, telescopes, and polite confusion. They explained that meteor showers were harmless collections of cosmic debris burning up in the atmosphere millions of miles above the reach of any scalp. The townspeople nodded, thanked them for their visit, and then quietly reinforced the lids on their nighttime hair buckets. Historians now look at the Osterfeld incident as a peculiar mix of stress coincidence and seasonal shedding. Some suggest that the meteor fear simply offered a visible scapegoat during a particularly bad outbreak of poor hygiene. Others say the bright lights triggered mass psychosomatic responses, anxiety so acute it affected hair health. But perhaps the truth is softer when faced with the unknown. People prefer a reason. And if the sky gives them a spectacle, they give it meaning. Even today, you can visit the village during the annual Persid shower. Locals gather still wearing wide hats, still murmuring old rhymes, and selling protective oils in tiny glass vials. Tourists laugh, but buy them anyway now, because in the quiet moment, when the first streak blazes across the night, even the most rational minds feel something stir, some ancient instinct whispering, "Cover your crown. The stars are watching." Tonight, your mind drifts not through smoky barbershops or frightened villages, but into the elegantly lit salons of 17th century nobility, where the mirrors are gilded, the perfume is thick, and the stars are not just watched, but wooed. In these circles, beneath velvet canopies, and beside fountains that whispered secrets into marble, a curious belief took root. The stars were not indifferent observers, but opinionated forces of taste. And if you dared to appear before them with hair undone or style neglected, you might just find yourself cosmically snubbed. It began with the astrologer poets of the Viennese court, refined, perfumed figures who composed verses about planetary personalities. Jupiter was bold, Venus flirtatious, Saturn deeply judgmental, and according to these stargazers, the celestial bodies bestowed not only fate, but also fashion advice. A badly pinned bun on a full moon, a statement of rebellion. A messy braid during a Venus transit, scandalous seduction. The stars weren't just watching, they were critiquing. So nobles adapted, not out of fear, but ambition. If the heavens had preferences, then it was one's duty to please them. Appear humble during a solar eclipse, appear bold under Mars, never attempt fringe on a Mercury day. And for the love of Neptune, never part your hair eastward during a waning crescent that they said was practically an invitation for social exile. Court diaries became playgrounds for such thinking. One countess wrote, "Today I wore a soft twist low on the nape to appease Saturn's critical glare. The conversation at supper was smoother than usual. I suspect correlation." Another nobleman noted his choice of powdered curls during a Jupiter conjunction, believing it earned him favor in a property dispute. It didn't, but his hair looked magnificent, and that apparently was consolation enough. This behavior birthed a curious subculture the star-approved set. They weren't a formal group, but everyone knew who they were, those whose style choices aligned so consistently with planetary motion that gossip pages speculated whether they had direct lines to the heavens. Invitations to gatherings noted lunar phases. Men chose wig height based on Venusian energy. Women wore gemstone pins not for sparkle, but to resonate with Mars's bluntness or mute Neptune's emotional chaos. Jewelry shops saw a boom in planetary-themed accessories. Combs inlaid with silver moons, hairpins tipped with lapis suns. Entire outfits were designed to honor celestial events, dresses stitched with constellations and sashes dyed to match the comet trails as described in that week's astrological bulletins. One duchess famously appeared in a gown woven with golden threads to mimic the Milky Way, her hair braided into the shape of Orion. Guests applauded. The stars presumably approved. But flattery is a delicate art. Overdo it, and the stars might turn fickle. A cautionary tale emerged from the court of Wallenberg, where Lady Anietta, a fashionable trendsetter, reportedly styled her hair to mirror the planetary alignment of a rare eclipse. Her coif 6 spirals, held in place by pins named after Roman gods, was declared astrological genius. That is, until the actual eclipse occurred and the clouds covered it entirely. Guests took it as a sign. The next week, her salon invitations dried up. She shaved her head in protest. Some called it avant-garde. Others called it cursed. History, as always, remained delightfully undecided. This cosmic fashion theology even reached the realm of flirtation. A well-known courtship game involved matching your hairstyle to your love interest's planetary sign. If they were a Leo, you might wear your curls proud and loose, a Virgo tidy and symmetrical. Libras preferred balanced twinned buns or mirrored waves. Nothing said, "I see your soul quite like a side part, angled to echo your crush's rising moon." Naturally, all this led to speculation. Did the stars reward those who flattered them? Did Neptune grant calm seas to those with sleek hair? Did Mars favor fiery locks in battle? Anecdotes flooded journals. A soldier claimed his lucky braid saved him from a musket ball. A merchant's hair braided into saturnine loops allegedly helped him win a bitter inheritance case. A child with curls that resembled a morning comet was proclaimed a prodigy before she could even speak. People saw what they wanted to see and then styled accordingly. Some courts employed official astro-stylists, a job that required both fashion sense and a firm grasp of planetary transits. Their job wasn't just to style, but to interpret. They'd greet clients with questions like, "Do you seek approval from Mercury today? Or would you prefer to deflect Mars?" They often spoke in cryptic metaphors. "Your crown chakra is too loud for this moon," one might murmur, combing with deliberate reverence. As with all trends, there were dissenters. A playwright in Prague mocked the movement with a comedy titled Locks of Lunacy, where noble characters changed hairstyles every hour based on a constantly shifting sky. In the play's final scene, the protagonist appears bald, exhausted, whispering, "At last I match the void." The audience laughed. The fashion-forward nodded solemnly, but even satire couldn't shake the idea that maybe, just maybe, the stars noticed us, that the gleam in your curls might echo something celestial, that a well-placed ribbon during a full moon could tip fate slightly in your favor. Not magic exactly, but etiquette. A polite nod to the cosmos. Somewhere between moon-aligned braids and Jupiter-approved buns, a quieter tradition grew in the background, one not written in court journals or whispered over goblets of clove wine. This was the art of hair divination, practiced by traveling seers, forest-dwelling hermits, and the occasional midwife with a taste for the dramatic. These individuals didn't just believe hair responded to the stars, they believed hair spoke, that each strand, curl, and part carried a message from the universe waiting to be read like tea leaves or the lines of a poem or the cracks in an old mirror after a storm. They called it reading the root, and it was treated with reverence. Not everyone could do it. One had to be born under a sensitive moon or trained during a meteor drizzle, or, according to one practitioner, be bitten by a goat during an equinox. Whatever the entry requirement, those who claimed the gift were both revered and avoided. Their tents smelled of pine smoke and vinegar. Their mirrors were always slightly fogged, and when they asked to run their fingers through your fate, people usually said yes. The ritual varied. In some villages, the reader would gently comb through your hair in silence, nodding occasionally as though translating whispers only they could hear. In others, the process involved chanting, oiling, and brushing the strands in exact numbers, often in multiples of 7 or 11. A common method required placing a single loose hair on a velvet cloth, then interpreting its curved thickness and split-end pattern. A forked end meant a difficult choice ahead. A perfectly smooth strand foretold a journey. A tightly curled root suggested secrets. And if the hair refused to lie flat no matter how much it was pressed, it meant resistance either from within you or from the universe itself. One famous hair reader, known only as Mother Lint, traveled from market to market with a cart labeled Strands of Destiny. She wore layers of wool, kept scissors in every pocket, and claimed she could tell your future by the way your hair fell after a sneeze. Skeptics scoffed until a skeptical merchant had his hair read by her on a dare. She warned him that his next contract would split in two like a frayed curl. The next month, his deal with a salt trader collapsed. He returned repentant and began brushing clockwise every morning just in case. It wasn't all warnings. Hair readings often included gentle affirmations. Your strands flow like spring rivers. You are closer to forgiveness than you think. Or the stubborn cowlick by your temple speaks of an idea you're afraid to voice. Say it soon. These moments were less prophecy and more poetry. But to those receiving them, they felt like truth. Of course, charlatans existed too. Some faked readings reciting vague platitudes. You seek purpose. You fear change. Your hair desires a deep conditioning mask. But the real readers, the trusted ones, never charged coin. They asked instead for a thread, a song, or a story, something to weave into their next reading, their next whisper with the cosmos. They believed everything was connected, and that hair, being alive yet silent, was a perfect medium for quiet truths. Among the most curious texts from this period is a small hand-bound volume titled The Whispering Scalp, written in 1699 by a man named Tobias Grendel, a self-described follicular philosopher. In it, he catalogues 43 messages received from Hare, including warnings about eclipses, blessings during childbearing, and one very specific prediction about the fall of a tower if its builder shaved during Mars retrograde. The tower did fall, though no one can prove the builder's grooming habits. Still, the legend stuck. Tobias also proposed a now-forgotten theory that hair was the last part of the body to forget sorrow. He wrote, "You may laugh again, you may walk lighter, but your hair will remember, not forever, but for a season, until the wind or a gentle hand tells it it is safe." Whether he meant it literally or as a metaphor is unclear, but even now it lingers a soft idea in a loud world. Hair readings eventually fell out of fashion. The rise of Enlightenment thinking and standardized grooming reduced space for such mysticism, yet fragments survived. In some rural parts of Europe, brides still have their hair blessed before a wedding, combed by a friend under moonlight, accompanied by silence. And in salons across the modern world, you'll still hear it that moment when a stylist pauses, touches your shoulder, and says, "Something on your mind," because sometimes, even now, your hair gives you away. Perhaps what these rituals offered beneath the smoke and oil and curling chants was not prophecy, but permission to sit still, to be touched kindly, to let someone see you without explanation. A rare gift even today. Tonight, we step quietly into a world where cutting one's hair wasn't just a fashion decision, it was a declaration of intent, a transformation ritual, and sometimes a public act of rebellion against the stars themselves. In the culture of the 17th century, the simple act of trimming a strand could carry weight far beyond aesthetics. And nowhere was this more clear than in the strange tradition known as the Comet Cut, a ceremonial haircut, performed not to follow the will of the heavens, but to defy it. The ritual emerged quietly in the late 1600s among a circle of young thinkers who had grown tired of living in fear of celestial omens. They saw their elders cancel weddings because a comet was spotted near Leo, postponed business ventures due to Mars smirking, and generally allow the night sky to dictate the most intimate parts of their lives, including, of course, their grooming. So in response, they began cutting their hair during comet sightings, not in mourning or panic, but in open challenge. The first known account comes from the coastal town of Grevonport, where a group of artists and scholars held what they called a starlight scissors supper. As a comet arced over the harbor, an impressive golden tail stretching across the water, they gathered on a rooftop, shared bread and spiced wine, and took turns clipping locks of one another's hair. The host, a young mapmaker named Isabel, reportedly stood atop a wooden stool, shears in hand, and declared, "If the sky dares glare at us, let it see our boldest selves." News of the gathering spread quickly. Some called it romantic. Others called it dangerous. The local priest called it heresy and blamed the next morning's fog on follicular pride. But the gesture struck a chord. Within months, other towns were holding their own comet cuts, some in secret, others as public festivals. The ritual developed variations. In some places, only bangs were trimmed, symbolizing a shift in vision, a literal reframing of perspective. In others, Entire braids were removed and burned in small clay dishes, their smoke meant to fog the star's judgment. A few communities buried the cut hair beneath fruit trees, believing it would confuse celestial surveillance. And in the most dramatic cases, individuals shaved their heads completely under the comet's gaze, declaring themselves unknowable. What made the comet cut so powerful wasn't the haircut itself, but the timing. It transformed fear into agency. In a world where every misplaced strand might be seen as a divine signal, choosing to cut your hair during a cosmic event was a kind of rebellion wrapped in scissors and symbolism. It said, "I see you, sky, but I choose me." Of course, not everyone was on board. Royal astrologers issued warnings claiming that haircut during a comet's reign would grow back misaligned with fortune. A physician in Prague insisted that such acts disrupted the natural synchronization of body and firmament, leading to digestive trouble and bad poetry. Some noble households banned the practice altogether, posting guards at salons during comet season. One duchess went so far as to lock her daughter's brushes in a cupboard until the comet passed, only to find them holding tiny scissors they'd hidden in their corsets. Teenagers, it seems, have always been resourceful. But the movement persisted. Diaries from the era contained dozens of quiet entries, trimmed my fringe beneath the streak, felt nothing but clean. Or the sky burned, and I let go of the braid I wore since morning. I no longer need it. The comet became less a sign of doom and more a mirror, one that invited people to examine what they were holding on to and whether it still served them. Even barbers began to adapt. One anonymous journal, believed to be from a barber in the city of Lormond, includes sketches of comet-inspired styles: the burning tail tuck, the solar sweep, and the slightly dramatic sky rebellion bob. He writes, "They come in whispering, asking for change. I pretend not to see the fire in their eyes, and I clip carefully. Not hair, fear." There's something deeply human about all of this. When faced with something vast, glowing, and impossible to understand, people responded not by retreating, but by trimming their bangs. They didn't ask for permission. They simply acted. And in that small, precise snip of a blade, they found the thing the stars could never offer: control. Eventually, as scientific understanding of comets improved, the ritual faded. Fewer people believed the sky was watching their scalps, but the idea endured in softer forms. Even now you might hear someone say, "I needed a change, so I cut my hair." No comet, no ritual. Just that same old impulse to meet the chaos of the world with a clean parting and a sharper silhouette. Tonight, we drift toward something both tender and strange, a belief that hair, when willingly given, could act as an offering to the sky. Not in the grand, dramatic sense of a human sacrifice or a flaming ritual on a hilltop, but in the quieter, more intimate form of a single lock snipped with care, then tied with ribbon and left beneath the stars. This practice, known in some circles as the night offering, blossomed in corners of Europe during the height of comet anxiety. And it all began with one question: if the stars are angry, could a token of humility soften their gaze? It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the tradition started, but surviving letters from the early 1700s tell of families in the northern provinces who would gather under the open sky on comet nights, usually in silence. Each person, from the eldest to the smallest child, would offer a strand of hair, sometimes cut with a silver knife, other times gently pulled and braided, first as though to preserve memory in the shape, These strands were then placed in small pouches made of linen wax paper or even flower petals, and buried beneath trees tucked into stone walls, or left at the edge of streams that reflected the heavens above. The logic behind it was simple, even if poetic. Hair was personal. It carried scent, story, and age. By offering part of themselves, not clothing or coins, but something grown in silence, people hoped to build goodwill with the unknowable. It wasn't about fear, it was about communication. A whispered exchange. "We see you. Please see us gently." In one village, it was customary to sing while releasing the offering. The song was simple, just a few syllables repeated, but meant to harmonize with the sky's current, as one journal puts it. In another town, lovers would braid their strands together before letting the wind take them, believing the stars would carry their names to each other if they ever became separated. A traveling peddler wrote of seeing dozens of small ribbon-bound locks tied to tree branches near a cliff edge, fluttering like soft prayers. The wind tugged at them, he noted, but they clung on. Some people offered hair for healing. A mother might give a snip from her own head in place of a sick child's pleading for protection. A widow might place her husband's last combed curl into a folded cloth, burying it beneath the moon in exchange for peaceful dreams. In more elaborate households, astronomers performed their own version, burning the lock beside a chart of the night's constellations while reciting coordinates like psalms. Even skeptics were known to participate, just in case, often muttering, "I don't believe it," but the stars have a way of holding grudges. Not all offerings were solemn. Some were theatrical. One noblewoman, famously frustrated with an unfavorable horoscope, is said to have cut her entire plait and launched it from a balcony shouting, "There, let my hair be your problem now." Mercury. A footman later retrieved the braid from a rose bush and sold it to a poet, who wore it as a sash until the scent faded. Another gentleman, known for his terrible luck in love, supposedly offered his sideburns to Venus 7 times before finally meeting someone who liked his cooking. There were even hair chapels, tiny shrines tucked into forests or on hilltops filled with offerings left by generations. No icons, no altars, just bundles of hair tied with hope, fear, or apology. Visitors would sometimes light candles or whisper wishes into the dusk. One popular inscription found scratched into the stone of such a place reads, "Let this strand carry what I cannot say aloud." Scholars today debate whether these practices were rooted in genuine belief or emotional ritual. Some argue that the offerings were symbolic confessions, a way to externalize burdens. Others see them as grief made tangible. Hair, after all, grows in silence and stays long after we cut it. To give it up was to acknowledge loss or desire or the aching need for change. And maybe that's what made the act sacred, not the stars, but the moment itself. The choosing of the strand, the steady snip, the softness of cloth, the quiet step into moonlight, hair and hand heart, slightly exposed. Modern echoes of this practice remain, though often unspoken. Locks of hair saved in envelopes after a baby's first cut. A braid wrapped in tissue hidden in a drawer after someone moves away. Even the ritual of running fingers through one's hair before making a hard decision, then finding a single fallen strand on a sleeve, offering itself perhaps to be left behind. So, as you lie here now listening to the hush between your breaths, think of those soft bundles tied in dusk. Not grand, not loud, just pieces of self sent skyward, not to bargain, but to be known. Tonight, your thoughts drift not toward grand rituals or royal salons, but into the quieter, dustier corners of daily life, the kind of place where old combs are kept in drawers beside dried herbs and candle stubs, and where gossip travels faster than light. In this part of our story, we explore something more peculiar than prophecy and more persistent than prayer. The long-standing superstition that your hairstyle could directly influence the rise or fall of your finances. Yes, money and hair, entwined in strands of belief tangled tightly across centuries. The idea wasn't born in a palace or a university lecture hall. It began as many old beliefs do with a coincidence. A farmer cut his hair before the harvest and lost half his crop. A merchant changed his parting before setting sail and returned with empty barrels. A baker shaved his beard on a waxing moon, and all his loaves came out hollow. At first, these stories were chalked up to bad luck. But over time, patterns began to emerge, or so people thought. By the mid-17th century, entire calendars were circulating with warnings about financially unlucky days to trim. In the German states, broadsheets printed small side columns listing hair days of caution, urging barbers to avoid scheduling customers during Saturn-heavy weeks. In parts of Italy, young apprentices were taught never to cut a client's hair on the third Thursday of the month, unless Jupiter was visibly calm. One pamphlet even claimed that fringe trimming during a Venus transit could cause coin to flow like water, unfortunately only away. It wasn't just timing, style mattered too. Tight curls were said to attract prosperity, while loose braids meant money would slip through the strands. Straight hair signaled clear fortune paths, but only if parted on the left-right side partings apparently invited unexpected debt. The widow Milena of the Borska district became locally infamous for reversing her husband's parting on a dare. Within a week, his prized goat disappeared and their wine barrels turned sour. No one ever parted their hair to the right again. Merchants, notoriously superstitious, took these warnings to heart. Some even carried small scrolls with lunar hair charts, consulting them before buying livestock or signing contracts. A trader named Pietro della Vigna refused to polish his boots or comb his beard on any day his astrologer marked with a red ink comet. If the heavens point down, your wallet empties up, he once explained cryptically to a confused apprentice. One particularly devout school of thought insisted that wealth flowed along invisible lines extending from the scalp. These abundance channels, as one pamphlet poetically named them, could be blocked or twisted by careless grooming. Hair knots were financial knots. Cowlick signaled a disobedient banknote. A temple too tightly clipped could pinch your savings into silence. The only known remedy, light brushing under candlelight while reciting an old rhyme, comb away, comb astray, let silver know the path to stay. Skeptics, as always, rolled their eyes. A barber in Antwerp wrote a sarcastic, open letter to his clients. Dear patrons, if your fringe caused your bankruptcy, I offer a full refund and a goat. He did not, however, offer to restyle. Even the doubters understood the risks of teasing fate through follicles. In wealthier circles, hair finance connections were often more discreet. Nobles hosted fortune evenings where guests arrived in styles deemed prosperous by their personal astrologers. High hair was in fashion during tax season, while low chignons meant restraint. Entire fortunes were whispered to rise and fall based on who dared wear curls when Saturn was sulking. A baroness once swore that trimming her split ends under the new moon doubled her jewelry collection. Her maid, however, claimed the increase came from a sudden inheritance, not the scissors. But not all the stories were cautionary. Some were oddly hopeful. A seamstress in Marseille wrote in her diary that she had braided a copper coin into her hair each morning for a month, and by the end of the season, she'd received 3 new clients and found a ring on the street. Coincidence? Probably. But her braids caught on, and soon girls all over the port city were hiding pennies in their plaits, whispering to them before sleep. There was even a popular charm sold in taverns, a silver comb inscribed with the phrase, "Comb, true coin, follow." These were often gifted during business deals believed to encourage fair negotiation. Some travelers refused to cross borders without first untangling their hair, claiming it freed the way for new fortune. Even pirates, according to one sailor's tale, brushed their beards under starlight before boarding enemy ships, not for intimidation, but for alignment with Mars, god of action and apparently loot. Over time, as banks replaced barter and ledgers replaced whispers, these beliefs faded, but remnants linger. Today you might still hear someone say, "Don't get a haircut before a job interview," or "Cutting your hair on payday is bad luck." Stylists still hear stories of breakups, job offers, and windfalls connected to a simple trip to the salon. And deep down, we all seem to understand changing your hair changes something, whether it's mood, confidence, or the silent choreography of coins in your pocket. Tonight, we unfurl a seafaring journal not of tides and maps, but of tangles and salted curls. For in the age of sail, when men crossed oceans in wooden hulls beneath constellations they could barely name, there lived a superstition among sailors that the sky judged their hair as keenly as it did their navigation. In this world, tangled locks meant tempests, clean trims promised calm seas, and the wrong parting could sink a voyage before the anchor left the sand. Hair on the high seas was more than vanity, it was an omen. It began as all good myths do, with a whisper in the wind. A deckhand combs his hair at dusk, and the ship hits a reef before dawn. A captain shaves his beard mid-transit, and a wave snaps the mainmast the next morning. No one can prove causality, but when you're weeks from shore and the only thing between you and the deep is timber and superstition, even coincidence starts to wear the weight of prophecy. Sailors came to believe that the sea watched them, and the stars above it too. If you disrespected either with reckless grooming, misfortune followed. Brushing your hair on open water was only allowed during sunrise or sunset, and only facing east. Combing at night, particularly under a full moon, was said to confuse the stars and invite storms. If your strands tangled on deck without cause, it was seen as a sign a storm brewed within a fortnight or mutiny simmered below deck. Hair length had meaning, too. Long hair, among sailors, wasn't always fashion, it was function, belief, and identity. Those who cut their hair at sea were thought to release their compass, leaving their internal direction scrambled. One legend tells of a first mate who trimmed his ends just off the coast of Portugal and spent the next 3 weeks navigating in circles. He arrived ashore swearing he'd heard the wind speak backward. Barbers on ships, if they existed, were treated with wary respect. Most doubled as surgeons or surgeons' assistants, and their shears were as feared as they were needed. A cut at sea had to be earned with a blessing, a coin, or a shared song. A silent trim, that was bad luck. A full shave, risky. And if you dared change your style mid-voyage, the crew expected some kind of offering, usually rum, sometimes a story, often both. There was also the matter of hair direction. Cowlicks pointing west, untrustworthy wind. A sailor whose part fell too far to the right might be marked storm-bound and excluded from anchor duty. Beards grown unevenly were said to unbalance the hull's favor. It sounds absurd until you imagine 30 men trapped together for months watching every small habit become myth under the weight of too much sky and too little land. Sailors also believed in the scalp itch omen. If your scalp itched suddenly while staring at the horizon, it meant a shipwreck was near or that someone had lied during the last port report. To soothe it, you had to dip a comb in seawater, pass it through your hair 3 times, and then throw the comb overboard with a curse. Naturally, this meant ship combs were replaced often, and many captains insisted they be made of driftwood to appease Poseidon. Then there were the dreamers, the ones who tied knots into their hair before sleeping, hoping to catch winds of fate. If they dreamed of waves, it meant safe passage. If the knots came undone overnight, it meant betrayal. Some tied seashells into their locks as charms. Others braided coins into their beards. One sailor, legendary among tavern tales, was said to have hidden a compass needle in his bun and never once missed landfall. No one ever found the bun or the needle, but the story endures like salt in old rope. Among the most elaborate of hair traditions was the first landfall braid. When a ship reached new territory, a lock of hair was cut and offered to the sea, sometimes braided, sometimes wrapped around a small token like a tooth or a feather. It was dropped overboard with a chant, "Let the sea know me, let the sky forgive me, let this place be kind." This rite was both thanks and apology. You survived. You dared. Now leave something behind. Back on land, these hair beliefs often faded, but not always. Some sailors returned home and refused to cut their hair ever again, believing it carried their journeys. Others stored braid clippings in tiny boxes, one per voyage, marking them like charts of emotion. Wives were known to tie ribbons to their husbands' beards before departure, each color, a blessing: red for strength, green for calm, and gold for return. These gestures weren't superstition. They were hope stitched with hair. Modern seafarers, of course, scoff at such rituals. Today's ships run on engines, not wind, and their crews follow radar, not rum. But ask around in the darker corners of old ports, and you might still find a sailor who tucks a shell into his sideburn or refuses to cut his hair before docking, not because he believes, but because he remembers. And maybe that's the point. The sea is vast, the stars are silent, and hair so fragile, so personal, offered a way to speak back, to mark the journey, to feel seen by forces too large to answer. Tonight, we unfurl a ribboned invitation and step into a courtyard bathed in lantern light, where an elegant couple stands at the threshold of matrimony, surrounded by flowers, family, and, if the stars permit, good fortune. But amid the lace and vows and polished shoes, there's another ritual at play, one both subtle and sacred: the bridal hairstyle. In the world of 17th century superstition, a bride's hair wasn't just arranged, it was orchestrated. Not merely for beauty, but for balance. Not just for elegance, but for protection from above. Throughout Europe, it was widely believed that a bride's hair held the essence of her fate. and that how it was combed, pinned, or left to flow would determine the harmony or hardship of her marriage. Every strand was symbolic, every twist a prayer, and every combing motion a conversation with the stars. While the ceremony bound two people before witnesses, the air spoke to something older, something celestial. Tradition dictated that a bride's hair should be untouched by scissors in the months leading up to the wedding. Cutting it too close to the ceremony was seen as severing future joy or snipping the thread of mutual understanding, as one old pamphlet poetically put it. Even a casual trim for split ends risked drawing the envy of Venus or confusing the fates assigned to her union. If the stars thought her hair unfinished, they might view the marriage the same way. Combing, too, was treated with reverence. In many regions, the final bridal combing was done not by a hairdresser, but by a female relative, most often the mother, though sometimes a grandmother or elder sister. The act was done slowly, usually the night before the wedding, in silence or accompanied by a whispered blessing. The chosen comb was often passed down through generations, carved from bone or polished wood and wrapped in ribbon when not in use. This combing was believed to transfer wisdom, calm the bride's nerves, and most crucially, untangle any spiritual knots that might block marital bliss. In Slavic regions, the braid played a central role. A bride would wear her hair in a single long braid, which her mother would carefully unravel on the wedding morning. The unbraiding symbolized a gentle release from childhood, a quiet surrender to a new life. No mirrors were allowed during this process. Looking into one was thought to invite vanity and worse, loneliness. Once the braid was undone, the hair was styled according to the couple's astrological chart, parted based on the bride's rising sign and pinned at intervals to mirror the groom's birth constellation. A fringe combed too far left might anger Mercury. A loose strand near the ear could let in jealousy. For brides in Western courts, hair was arranged to balance planetary influences. A popular style called the halo coil featured a soft twist at the crown meant to mirror the shape of Venus's orbit. Hairpins were inserted in multiples of 3 or 7, depending on which planets were deemed attentive that month. Pearls, the most favored decoration, symbolized lunar harmony. But woe to the bride who wore rubies under a Mars-heavy sky. They were said to burn with marital disputes. Even the placement of flowers held meaning: rosemary on the left temple for loyalty, chamomile near the nape for patience, and violets along the part for fidelity. Of course, as with all traditions, the rules were often broken. One rebellious bride from Austria insisted on cutting her hair into a bob just days before her wedding, claiming that if the stars disapproved, they were welcome to send her a letter. Her marriage lasted 47 years. Another bride dyed her hair with crushed iris petals to match a comet visible during her ceremony. The comet, unfortunately, was linked to crop failure, and she was later blamed for a poor wine harvest. Beauty, in the end, proved a risky business. Grooms, while less scrutinized, were not exempt. It was considered bad luck for a groom to cut or style his hair on the wedding day, unless his bride combed it herself. This combing was done before sunrise and always facing east, so that the marriage would begin with light. If the bride cried during the process, the couple was said to be blessed with children. If the groom flinched, it foretold a stubborn marriage. If he fell asleep, according to one pamphlet, it simply meant he'd snore for the next decade. In one particularly charming custom, some couples would braid a single hair from each of their heads into a shared thread, then seal it in wax and bury it beneath the wedding threshold. The belief that the stars would find them by that strand and bind their fortunes gently together. Some returned to dig up the thread on anniversaries. Others left it untouched, content to let it anchor them in unseen ways. Though many of these rituals have faded, echoes linger. Today, stylists still ask about your relationship status while curling your bangs. Wedding packages still include trial styles as though testing what fate prefers. And somewhere, a bride still hands her comb to her mother the night before the big day, not because of Venus, perhaps, but because it feels right. Tonight, we light a candle and pull our chair a little closer to the hearth, not for warmth, but to listen. Because in the hush of centuries past, when stories held more sway than science and shadows stretched longer than sense, there thrived a curious notion that a person's hair could record sound. Yes, sound. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense of your hair remembers your laughter, but literally. It was believed by some that hair, those fine keratin strands growing quietly from your scalp, could absorb whispers, echoes, even full conversations like miniature phonograph wires coiled in secret. You might raise an eyebrow. Understandable. But consider the world before recording devices, before voice memos and magnetic tape. Back then, sound was ephemeral gone the moment it was spoken. The idea that something physical might retain at something as intimate and ever-present as hair wasn't so far-fetched. And so from village corners to candlelit studies, the theory took root that strands of hair were not just alive, but attentive. This belief began to surface in the late 17th century, particularly among mystics and experimental philosophers who dabbled in natural magic. One widely circulated tract of vibrations in the humor of strands claimed that as the lute string is stirred by air unseen, so too may hair be shaken into memory by sound. The author, writing under the pseudonym Dr. Lysander of Wiltshire, insisted that hair held echoes of emotional noise, particularly those linked to grief, joy, or betrayal. According to him, a single lock could store years of laughter if properly wrapped in linen and never exposed to sharp sounds thereafter. Women especially were thought to carry emotional archives in their hair. Romantic poets built entire verses around the idea of hearing their lover's voice in a strand long after parting. Her braid still spoke, wrote one Scottish bard, though she herself had turned to frost. Some grieving widows would keep their husband's hair in glass pendants not just for mourning, but for supposed sonic comfort. A few even pressed the strands to their ears on stormy nights, listening for murmurs of old lullabies. The practice evolved. In Prague, a salon named Whispers and Waves offered auditory cleansing treatments, brushing clients' hair with silver combs dipped in rosewater while murmuring affirmations to clear the lingering echoes. In southern France, it was common for brides to burn a snippet of hair on their first wedding anniversary, releasing the stored vows to the heavens so the universe could remember them too. Even scientists of the time were not entirely dismissive. An English physicist named Edwin Tillwater conducted a series of eccentric experiments involving hair suspended near tuning forks. He claimed that different notes caused visible vibrations in freshly cut strands, suggesting a natural receptivity to sonic character. While modern readers might chuckle, his notes, now preserved in faded journals, show a sincere belief that hair was in some forgotten way a receiver. Not everyone approved. Church authorities warned against hair divining, claiming it bordered on witchcraft. Some towns banned the practice of listening locks, wherein individuals would braid strands and hang them over cradles to catch first words. One bishop declared, "Only God may record the soul's sound. Man's hair is but hay." Harsh, yet the belief endured in quieter forms. In rural England, it became customary to cut a small lock of a baby's hair and whisper blessings into it before sealing it inside a locket. That locket would often be passed down generations, regarded not just as a keepsake, but as a vessel of voice of wish of warning. Some families swore these lockets vibrated faintly when opened near music or prayer. In the Ottoman Empire, court attendants were known to gently twist strands of hair while reciting verses, believing the poetry would be braided in and could later be read by those with sensitive fingers. One courtier claimed he felt the syllables of an ancient song pulse through a sultan's widow's braid like a river behind silk. The notion grew more theatrical in the salons of Paris, where nobles would sometimes stage hair readings for entertainment. A guest would present a lock of hair, and a fortune teller, often dressed in extravagant robes, would place it against her temple, close her eyes, and claim to hear secrets, past loves, hidden regrets, snide remarks from relatives long gone. Whether true or not, the idea that your hair might betray you made for excellent drama. Today, of course, we understand that hair is not a recorder. It has no auditory capacity, no memory, and no replay button. And yet, modern forensic science does confirm that hair holds chemical traces of experience, stress diet, and environment. It knows what you've breathed, what you've feared, and even what you've swallowed. Is that so far from the idea of sound? If we accept that vibrations shape us, perhaps it isn't strange to imagine that some part of you still resonates with an old laugh stored quietly in the curve of a curl. Tonight, you find yourself seated beneath the flickering glow of a candle stub, pages of a weathered almanac spread before you. It smells faintly of rosemary and lamp oil. You're not consulting the stars tonight, nor reading tea leaves, but rather turning to something closer, something headbound. Because in this chapter of odd history, we return to the humble calendar, but not for dates of war or harvest. No, we examine the curious obsession early Europeans had with tracking haircut omens, a sort of follicular fortune-telling bound in ink and tied to the heavens. The idea of timing a haircut according to celestial bodies was not born from barbers, but from astrologers. Long before the invention of the wall calendar as we know it, medieval physicians and sky watchers had already compiled tables suggesting auspicious days for various bodily acts, bathing, bloodletting, nail trimming, and quite often haircuts. These acts weren't viewed as trivial. To trim one's hair was to interfere with a bodily rhythm, one that, if misaligned with the stars, could throw a person's health, wealth, or love life into spiraling disarray. One of the earliest surviving cutting calendars was the Capillum Prognosticum, compiled in 1611 by a Bavarian physician named Johann Velter. It divided the lunar cycle into 28 symbolic hair zones, assigning traits to each day. Want stronger roots. Cut on the third day of the waxing moon. Hoping to grow it longer, Only snip on a Sagittarius Thursday. Wishing for love, trim your bangs at twilight, but only if Venus is not retrograde and your shoelaces are tied evenly. Yes, really. One copy includes this note. By the mid-17th century, this practice had gone mainstream. Calendars printed in France, Germany, and parts of Italy often included a haircut horoscope section near the back. These weren't quaint additions, they were considered essential, nestled between harvest dates and feast days. Haircuts were no longer mundane, they were moments of cosmic alignment. In cities like Strasbourg, barbers were expected to be fluent in these forecasts. Customers would arrive not simply for a trim, but for guidance. I've been having trouble sleeping. Should I cut near the neck this week? Or my husband is distant. Perhaps I should reshape my fringe under a Gemini moon. Barbershops became half salon, half sanctuary. Some even posted moon phase charts above their mirrors. Others sold celestial oils meant to counteract poor haircut timing, usually scented with lavender, bergamot, or crushed comfrey root. The logic behind these rituals was rooted in humoral theory and lunar magnetism. It was thought that the moon, which pulls tides, must also influence bodily fluids, blood, bile, and the mysterious essence that nourished hair. A bad cut on a waning moon might leach the spirit, leaving hair dull, brittle, and unlucky in commerce. Conversely, trimming under a rising Aries was believed to embolden the wearer, making them more persuasive and quick-witted. Good for merchants, terrible for gamblers. Astrology handbooks from the era even included emergency override prayers in case someone accidentally got a haircut on an inauspicious day. One suggested spinning 3 times counterclockwise while brushing the loose strands into a hearth and whispering, "Let what was snipped slip past the stars." Another advised sleeping with the cut hair under your pillow for a night, then burying it beneath a rosebush to neutralize Saturn's sour gaze. Despite its popularity, not everyone agreed on the rules. Protestant reformers denounced the practice as vanity bordering on idolatry. One pamphlet warned, "He who times his trim to Venus shall find his morals split like ends." Enlightenment thinkers, meanwhile, scoffed. A French mathematician famously quipped, "If hair obeyed Mars, I'd wear a helmet of wigs to win every chess match." And yet, he was often seen sneaking into a barber on days marked with a tiny green circle in his pocket diary. Eventually, the trend began to fade, eclipsed by the rise of science skepticism and the realization that sometimes your split ends just need trimming, regardless of Jupiter's opinion. But remnants remain. Some modern lunar calendars still offer haircut guidance. Stylists occasionally hear clients mumble, "I heard waxing moon is good for volume." And barbers with vintage decor often hang replicas of 17th century haircut tables, not for use, but for charm. Though maybe, just maybe, they're still consulted in secret. Tonight, we slip into the shadowy folds of superstition and open the creaky drawer of 17th century medical folklore, a time when hair wasn't just for styling or omens, but for healing, or more precisely for extracting the curses and illnesses believed to curl themselves into the body like knots in a ribbon. Because in the quiet corners of Europe, particularly in rural villages from Bavaria to Brittany, there lived a strange belief that illness could be combed out of the body through the hair. Yes, you read that right, combed, with purpose, with rhythm, with hope. These weren't your average grooming sessions. They were known as healing combings, a mix of folk ritual, herbal remedy, and a touch of what modern eyes might label placebo. But to the people who practiced them, they were serious medicine. The principle was simple, just as knots and tangles disrupted the flow of hair, so too could emotional or physical ailments disturb the body's natural harmony. And if the hair could be soothed, perhaps the soul or spleen could be too. It often began with a consultation, not with a doctor, but with a hair-wise woman. These women, sometimes called strand mothers or tangle witches, were respected figures who carried with them combs carved from ashwood, pearwood, or even bone, depending on their region and tradition. Each comb had its own purpose. Wide-toothed for melancholy, fine-toothed for fevers, curved for heartbreak. The afflicted would sit silently in front of the practitioner while she murmured a chant, usually under her breath, almost inaudible, as though coaxing the illness out by stealth. Some combings were done in complete darkness to prevent the sick aura from leaping onto the walls. Others took place at dawn, so the first light could carry the ailment away. If the comb caught or snagged, it was taken as a sign of deep-seated sorrow or unresolved guilt, or rather dramatically, a curse cast by a jealous neighbor. In Saxony, there was a belief that recurring nightmares could be linked to hair sleep traps, where dream residue tangled itself into the strands at night. The solution? A rosemary oil combing performed backward from neck to brow while reciting the names of 3 peaceful rivers. If the person fell asleep during the process, the curse was said to drain into the pillow. The pillow, unfortunately, would then be buried or burned. These rituals were not without structure. A full healing combing followed a strict order. First dry brushing the scalp to wake the thoughts, then 3 passes for each major emotion: grief, fear, and envy. The back of the head was for the past, the sides for relationships, and the crown for future clarity. Afterward, the strands caught in the comb were often sealed in wax or pressed into old books to keep the sickness from finding a new home. One German parish record from 1642 even notes a case where an entire village refused a local physician's services during an outbreak of winter chills, preferring instead to queue outside a comb healer's cottage. He allegedly treated 30 people in one day, burning each person's combed-out hair in a cedar wood brazier. The fever subsided within a week. Coincidence likely, but to the villagers, it was proof enough. Of course, as medical science advanced, these traditions faded or were pushed to the margins. Enlightenment scholars dismissed the comb healing method as quaint nonsense. One physician famously sneered, "If fever exits by follicles, then I suggest we brush the whole continent into good health." Yet, in private diaries and domestic journals, the practice quietly endured. A mother might comb her sick child's hair in the moonlight just to be safe. A widow might keep her late husband's comb wrapped in linen, believing it held the last calm of his breath. Interestingly, modern psychology does lend a sliver of credence to the emotional relief such rituals might have brought. Gentle, repetitive movements, the sensation of hair being combed, and the focused attention of a caring presence all activate calming responses in the brain. Touch, routine, and belief, those 3 ingredients, whether in a clinic or a cottage, have always formed a potent medicine. Today, we see echoes of these comb healing practices in spa treatments, scalp massages, and even the mindful rituals of hair care influencers whispering into microphones. And if someone tells you brushing their hair helps them think clearer, they're participating in a tradition older than they know. Tonight, let's stroll slowly into the well-lit corridors of aristocratic eccentricity, where beauty routines mingled freely with alchemy, and the simple act of hair washing could spark debates fit for a royal court. Because in certain upper-class circles of the 17th century, especially among French nobility, washing your hair was considered not only suspicious, but downright radical. And while peasants might rinse their heads in streams or cover them with herbs, the elite preferred powders, pomades, and occasionally philosophical arguments about whether water was too emotional for hair. You see, for much of early modern Europe, hygiene was a battlefield of ideas. People believed that bathing, especially with hot water, opened the pores too widely, letting in sickness. Hair, viewed as an extension of the nervous system by some, was especially vulnerable. To wet it carelessly was to invite melancholy bad dreams or, in extreme cases, romantic disobedience. Thus, dry maintenance became the fashion. A powdered scalp was a proper scalp. This gave rise to the powdered pomade era, when hair was not so much cleaned as neutralized. Wealthy individuals, particularly those in Versailles or Milan, would go weeks or months without touching water to their hair. Instead, they applied a mixture of crushed white clay iris root and sometimes starch, mixed with perfume. The result, a head that smelled like a flower shop on payday and looked like an elaborate pastry under siege. But that didn't mean hair was left unattended. Quite the opposite. Elaborate morning rituals were built around the maintenance of these powdered creations. Ladies-in-waiting or hired valets would carefully lift and restyle towering wigs or natural hair scaffolds using metal combs, silk scarves, and squirrel hair brushes. Special attention was paid to keeping the powder even not too thick near the ears, not too sparse at the crown. In one handbook, it was advised to check the balance of powder using a silver mirror and the whisper of a friend. No friend, try a goose feather. Apparently, it gave honest feedback. Of course, with powder came problems. Excess buildup could lead to itching, flaking, and in some cases, spontaneous philosophy. One nobleman famously wrote a treatise titled Of Dust and Dignity, arguing that hair powder represented the ephemeral condition of knowledge, and that to scratch your scalp during a lecture was merely an act of humility. Another lady, in a letter to her sister, complained that her powdered hair had attracted a nesting bird during an outdoor sermon. The bird refused to leave until bribed with almonds. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was also politics. Court etiquette dictated that powdered hair signaled control, wealth, and intellect. Water-washed hair, that was for gardeners, actors, or most scandalous of all philosophers. One salon gossip recounts the downfall of a minor viscount who appeared at a dinner with moistened locks prompting a duchess to faint and a bishop to spill his port. His defense, "I wish to feel the wind on my real scalp." The scandal was immortalized in a poem involving Zephyr's betrayal and lather. Still, whispers of change were rising. Some reform-minded physicians, emboldened by enlightenment, thought began advocating for occasional rinsing, particularly with rainwater or infusions of lavender. They warned of the poisonous accumulation of powders, citing cases of powdered wigs catching fire near candles or attracting mice. One dramatic pamphlet told of a lady who leaned too close to her harpsichord and left a full impression of her hairstyle and dust on the keys. By the centuries, close change was in the air literally. Hair washing began to regain some medical credibility, especially in warmer climates. Thermal rinsing became a luxurious spa trend. Aristocrats visiting bathhouses in Italy or Germany began timidly experimenting with wetting just the ends, then advancing cautiously to full rinses under supervision. There were even cleansing concerts where musicians played soft violin, while bath attendants gently poured rosemary water onto the client's scalp. The goal convinced the follicles it was not an assault, but a sonata. Today, of course, we wash our hair with impunity, arguing not about whether to rinse, but how often. Twice a week, every day, only on weekends when Mercury is in Pisces, and you have a job interview. The debates persist, but the stakes are lower. No one will exile you from a drawing room for shampooing. At worst, you'll be offered conditioner. So, as you ease into sleep tonight, hair loose or braided, perhaps still damp from an evening shower, smile gently for those powdered pioneers who feared the bath but faced the world with a head held high and a hat full of starch. Tonight, we enter a space that many of your ancestors would have considered sacred, fraught, and hilariously confusing: the barbershop. But not just any barbershop, a 17th century one complete with polished blades, jars of leeches, and an attitude that straddled the line between hairstylist and battlefield surgeon. You might walk in hoping for a light trim and walk out having been bled, blistered, and lightly lectured on planetary alignment. Because back then the barber wasn't just a barber, he was the barber surgeon, a profession as curious as it sounds. Let's set the scene. The red and white striped pole still spins today, but its origin, that's the bandage. Red for blood, white for clean cloth. The pole itself represented the staff patient's grip while undergoing bloodletting, a procedure both terrifying and disturbingly common. In other words, that cheerful candy swirl outside your local barbershop is a historical monument to controlled hemorrhaging. Sweet dreams. These early barbers were trained not only in trimming beards, but also in lancing boils, pulling teeth, setting bones, and on bold days performing minor surgeries. A good barber kept scissors in one drawer and scalpels in the next. Their toolkit often included razors, tooth extractors, sewing needles, and a variety of ointments, with names like snake salve or blessed wax of St. Erasmus. And because anesthetics hadn't yet hit the market, most procedures were accompanied by a sturdy strap, a leather bit to bite down on. And if you were lucky, a lute player in the corner to drown out the yelling. Haircuts in this setting were surprisingly ceremonial. Customers believed the timing and method of a haircut could influence everything from appetite to mood. Some barbers insisted on cutting hair while facing east to align with the rising of strength. Others swore by Tuesday mornings, which, according to certain astrologers, made the soul more receptive to beauty. For particularly unruly hair barbers would light aromatic herbs like rosemary or myrrh beneath the chair, not to calm the customer, but to appease the follicle spirits that might resist trimming. But the true drama came when someone needed more than a cut. Imagine walking into a barber's tent in 1683 with a toothache. You'd be reclined in a wooden chair, a leather apron fastened tightly around your chest. The barber would heat his tools over coals not for sanitation, but to wake their edge. A quick prayer might be mumbled for speed, not mercy, and then yank. If you survived the shock without insulting your lineage, you'd be offered a glass of fortified wine and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. The tooth would be tossed into a bucket labeled unlucky roots. Some barbers took their dual role quite seriously. They kept illustrated manuals, part fashion book, part anatomy chart. One such volume from 1659 shows a diagram of head zones with notes like trim here for lively conversation. Another page simply reads, "Do not cut near the ears during Mercury's fall." Between the scissors and saws, these men walked a fine line between confidence and chaos. Naturally, not everyone approved. Academic physicians often disdained barbers as uneducated meddlers, accusing them of turning ailments into hairstyles and vice versa. But barbers had one crucial advantage: accessibility. They were everywhere, affordable, and most importantly, they listened. Whether curing heartbreak or boils, they offered a kind of care that was immediate, tactile, and oddly personal. In fact, many barbers kept small journals of client moods so they could adjust their approach accordingly. A sullen man might be offered a haircut to lighten the spirit, while a lovesick youth could receive a hair charm braided with mint and lavender to increase courage in courtship. In London, one barber became famous for offering philosophical shaves, during which he'd discuss ethics while removing stubble with a blade so sharp it was called the whisper. He had regulars. One of them was rumored to be a playwright who stole half of his dialogue from the barber's comments. Eventually, the profession split. Surgeons eager to distinguish themselves pushed for official separation. By the late 18th century, most countries had distinct medical colleges and left the barbers to the scissors and soap suds. But the traces remain. Even now, your local barber may still offer a hot towel with a reverence bordering on the liturgical. And isn't there still something oddly healing about a fresh haircut when you're feeling off? So tonight, as your head sinks into the pillow, imagine the gentle snip of ancient scissors near your ear, the warm scent of herbs in the air, and the firm but friendly hand of someone who understands both split ends and sorrow. Sleep in the knowledge that centuries ago, a stranger might have cut your hair and reset your dislocated thumb, all in the same appointment. Tonight, let's wander out of the city, away from powdered courts and razor-sharp salons, and into the countryside where superstition swayed like wheat in the wind, and even a strand of hair could carry the weight of a curse. Because in rural Europe, especially during the 17th century, hair wasn't merely decorative or symbolic. It was dangerous. It could be stolen, twisted, burned, or buried to bring bad luck, heartache, or an unfortunate tendency to moo like a cow during thunderstorms. Hair, to put it plainly, was a tool of witchcraft. In these villages, cutting your hair wasn't just about style, it was a moment of vulnerability. To lose a lock meant potentially handing over a part of your soul. This belief stretched across cultures and centuries, but in the era we're visiting tonight, it was at its most peculiar. Farmers kept their trimmings in secret drawers. Children were told never to let birds steal their fallen hairs, lest they weave them into nests and trap the child spirit inside a tree. And God forbid your enemy got a hold of your brush. Next thing you knew, your livestock were sterile and your bread refused to rise. One of the most enduring fears was that of the binding curse. In this charming ritual, a lock of hair, yours not theirs, would be braided with black thread knotted 9 times while muttering intentions, love, revenge, silence, etc., and then buried under a doorstep or sewn into the lining of clothing. The victim might experience anything from mild confusion to a lifetime of bad luck, all because someone swiped a few strands off your shoulder after a village dance. And how were these threats handled? With counter magic, of course. In parts of Scotland and Wales, mothers would burn the first haircut of a baby before sunset, believing the smoke would warn off meddling eyes. In northern Italy, people would wrap their hair in linen soaked in vinegar and salt and hide it under the floorboards, just in case a jealous neighbor tried to hex their curls. One 17th-century housewife reportedly placed her entire family's hair trimmings in small clay pots, then stacked them beside onions in the root cellar. The onions absorbed the evil. She never explained why the soup tasted so funny. Some barber shops doubled as protective spaces. They advertised curse-safe disposal of trimmings, promising to burn your clippings while reciting a protective rhyme. There were even traveling hair collectors who claimed to find and neutralize cursed hair bundles hidden by spiteful ex-lovers or vengeful aunts. Most were con artists, of course, but they played to a fear that ran deep hair wasn't just about you. It was you. Even love had its tangle. Giving someone a lock of your hair was a gesture of intense trust. But if the relationship soured and the lock remained, things got tricky. Some jilted lovers would toss the braid into a river to wash away the bond. Others would bury it near crossroads to confuse the spirits and forget the heartbreak. There's even a record of a woman in Bohemia who tried to braid her ex's hair with nettles and throw it into a pigsty. The pigs, unimpressed, ate it. Her curse was later dismissed as digestively absorbed. Of course, not every hair ritual was ominous. In Finland, braiding hair before bed was seen as a protective act. A tight braid was believed to keep dreams straight, while loose hair invited wandering spirits. In Poland, lovers would sometimes braid a single hair from each partner into a horseshoe and hang it above the door, hoping to secure endless returns. Romantic. Also, slightly unsanitary. Modern science offers no support for the idea that your fate can be tugged around by a strand of keratin. And yet, even today, some of us flinch when we see a stray hair on a stranger's sweater, or feel a prickle of suspicion when we find our own hairbrush out of place. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's the echo of 400 years of whispered warnings in candlelit kitchens. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, your hair gently brushing the pillow, take comfort in this: no one is burying your clippings in the garden. No one is braiding your fate under the stairs. And if a bird steals your strand tomorrow, don't worry. It probably just wants to be cozy. Tonight, we drift into quieter spaces, not salons or stormy fields, but into the gentle private hours of night, when a brush moves slowly through hair and superstition becomes routine. Because in the candlelit corners of 17th-century households, brushing one's hair before bed wasn't just about detangling. It was a ritual, a meditation, and occasionally a form of midnight storytelling passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to child, or from a lonely bachelor to the mirror murmuring things best left unspoken. Across Europe, nightly hairbrushing carried deep cultural weight. In England, women were told to brush their hair exactly 100 strokes before bed, not more, not less. This wasn't just a beauty habit. It was said to release the day's burdens through the scalp, drawing out restlessness and bad dreams. In France, aristocratic journals suggest brushing while reciting a poem or prayer, ideally in couplets. The rhythm of verse matched the strokes, calming both mind and body. Even hardened soldiers, when off the battlefield, would brush their beards slowly with the same methodical attention, believing it untied the knots of fate. The brushes themselves were treasured objects. Made of boar bristle ivory or carved oak, many were personalized with initials, family crests, or secret compartments for storing charms. Some were passed down through generations, not just as heirlooms, but as quiet guardians of memory. In northern Germany, it was common to whisper a secret into your hairbrush before bed, under the belief that the bristles would hold the thought until morning, like a diary that never betrayed you. Superstitions clung to this act like static electricity. Brushing someone else's hair was intimate but risky. You were stirring their thoughts, as one old proverb put it, and if you brushed carelessly, you might disrupt their dreams, or worse, take on their worries yourself. Some households had firm rules: never brush hair after midnight, never brush in front of an open window, and absolutely never leave a hairbrush lying bristle up overnight. It invited confusion or foxes. It was unclear which was worse. But not all rituals were grim. In parts of Ireland and Scotland, bedtime brushing was a moment for song. Children would sit cross-legged while an elder brushed their hair and sang lullabies, some of which trace back centuries. The strokes had rhythm matched to the meter. Hair here became a thread between generations, one that hummed softly with comfort, familiarity, and the warmth of being known. A 1681 journal from the Highlands notes, "I could not sleep until I heard the bristles sing." Men, too, partook in the ritual, though often in secret. A merchant from Prague wrote of brushing his hair behind a curtain each night, believing it helped him order his ambitions. In Spain, scholars advised students to brush before reciting their lessons aloud, claiming it opened the ears of the mind. While these routines may not have had measurable effects, they offered something more subtle, a sense of rhythm, a tactile punctuation mark at the end of the day. And then, of course, there were the hairbrush omens. If your brush lost more than 7 hairs in a single session, it was considered a warning either of illness, heartbreak, or impending travel. If the bristles bent during use, it meant someone was speaking ill of you. A dropped brush foretold a visitor, a tangled stroke at the nape of the neck. Someone was hiding a secret from you. Was any of it true? Probably not. But when the wind howls at the window and your candle flickers low, a little belief can be a comfort. Eventually, as the Enlightenment advanced and personal grooming habits shifted, many of these traditions faded or were reduced to quaint superstition. But the act endured. The stroke of bristle on scalp, the hush that follows, the sense of closure it brings, no matter what sort of day preceded it. Even now, countless people continue the ritual, maybe not with 100 strokes, maybe not with poems or prayers, but with purpose, with quiet, with a little bit of grace tucked into the motion, and that in its own way is a kind of magic. So tonight, as your head sinks into the pillow and the day folds itself into dreams, let the memory of those ancient brushes guide your thoughts into stillness. Let each hair lie where it may. Let the story stay whispered in the bristles. Tonight we open the creaky door to another odd corner of 17th century life, a space where astronomy, fashion, and frantic social speculation collided the royal court. Specifically, we turn our gaze upward to the heavens, where comets flared across the night sky and left behind far more than gas and dust. Because in this peculiar age, the sudden appearance of a comet could cause hysteria not only among sky watchers and philosophers, but also among hairdressers, wig makers, and society ladies who feared one terrifying possibility, that a comet could ruin your hairstyle. Let's pause and breathe that in. You live in an era where telescopes are just beginning to peek at the stars with something resembling scientific rigor. Yet despite all this, many well-dressed citizens firmly believe that the path of a celestial object light years away might disrupt their personal grooming. Why? Because in a time when cause and effect were still up for creative interpretation, comets were understood not as natural events, but as cosmic warnings. And bad hair was one of their most chilling signs. In 1618, 3 comets streaked across the European sky in quick succession, prompting a wave of panic. But the panic wasn't only about plagues, famines, or war. It also spilled into salons and royal dressing rooms. People believed the comet's chaotic tails signaled disorder, and for fashion-forward elites, this translated quite literally to misbehaving curls, collapsing wigs, and brittle ends. Some even blamed sudden cases of alopecia on the emotional disturbance caused by viewing a comet with the naked eye. One noblewoman in Bavaria reportedly wore a padded bonnet for weeks, fearing that a loose strand would invite madness. This wasn't just gossip. Pamphlets and illustrated broadsheets warned readers to cover the head when gazing upon fiery stars, and hair care guides of the period advised switching from goose fat pomade to lavender oil during celestial unrest, as the latter was believed to quiet the flame of heaven's breath. There were even comet-specific hair charms, tiny silver pendants shaped like stars meant to be braided discreetly into wigs or bonnets for protection. Some courts held formal comet vigils where servants would light candles and apply gravity powder to the hair of attendees, hoping to weigh down stray locks and avoid symbolic disarray. The link between celestial disorder and coiffure chaos went even deeper. One astrologer, Lady Winifred Bletchley, claimed that each hair on the human head resonated with a particular star. If a comet disrupted the harmony of the cosmos, it would naturally send tremors through your scalp. She offered personalized star charts for the hair, which recommended not only lucky styling days, but also which parting direction best aligned with your birth moon. Historians remain unclear on whether anyone's hair actually benefited, but Lady Bletchley did retire comfortably in a manner filled with scented combs and gullible nobility. Fashion responded, as fashion always does, dramatically. In Paris, women began styling their hair to resemble comets, with long, trailing curls pinned behind tight chignons called coiffures astrales. In Rome, stylists adopted the flame sweep, a high forward curl that mimicked a burning arc. And in London, the more daring sort bleached a single streak of hair white to signal both fashion savvy and cosmic awareness. Critics scoffed, of course, but the trend endured through several comet seasons. For common folk, especially in the countryside, the reaction was more cautious. Midwives warned expectant mothers not to comb their hair during a comet's peak, lest they part the child's fortune. Farmers wore hats indoors. Schoolmasters insisted students recite their prayers while brushing. And in one small Danish village, an entire festival was postponed because the mayor's wife couldn't get her curls to hold during a particularly bright meteor shower. The heavens are not in order, she declared. Neither shall we be. Today, we smile at these stories. We know comets are icy wanderers, not harbingers of hair-related doom. But is the impulse really so alien? Haven't we all blamed a bad mood, a bad day, or a bad photo on the weather of the stars, or some unknowable shift in the universe? Hair, after all, is often the most visible part of how we present ourselves to the world. It reacts to humidity, to stress, and to sleep or lack of it. Why not in another lifetime to a blazing visitor in the night sky? So tonight, as you lie beneath your own sky, whether cloudy or clear, know this: your hair is safe. No comet will judge your bangs. No meteor will mock your curls. And if your part is a little crooked, well, maybe it's just stargazing. Tonight, we tiptoe through the quiet chambers of obsession, a place where 17th-century thinkers sat by candlelight, furiously scribbling beneath portraits of Saturn, trying to unlock the cosmos, while also wondering occasionally if their wigs looked crooked. Because for all the serious work of early astronomy, there was an odd and persistent anxiety humming under the surface. What if the stars were watching you back and silently judging your grooming? Among Europe's growing class of amateur astronomers, stargazing was both a noble pursuit and a personal drama. These were people who tracked planetary motion with hand-ground lenses and complex brass instruments, but who also lived in a culture that linked physical appearance to cosmic order. You weren't just studying the stars, you were aligning with them. And if your cuffs were wrinkled or your curls misbehaved during a Jupiter retrograde, well, no wonder your observations were imprecise. Take Johannes Kepler, for example, a giant in the history of science. His work on planetary motion reshaped the heavens, but he also once complained in a letter that a court astrologer's prediction had left him suspicious of the state of his beard. There's no official record of how seriously he took his facial hair's relationship to Mars, but the fact that he mentioned it at all suggests a truth about the era people wanted their appearance to harmonize with the sky. The concept of celestial sympathy was widely accepted. One's physical form, especially the head, was seen as a map of the universe. Hair whirls, cowlicks, and the direction of growth each could be interpreted as a signal. Some claimed that a spiral at the crown pointed toward a Saturnine temperament, while a widow's peak marked a strong connection to the moon. Barbers and astrologers sometimes worked side by side, one handling the shears, the other the stars. Clients would request a cut that balances the influence of Mercury or a style that draws in the favor of Venus. Was it fashion? Was it philosophy? Or was it just another way of feeling slightly more in control of the unknowable? Naturally, there were skeptics. Some university students in Leiden famously staged a parody hair horoscope in 1642, assigning zodiac signs to hair types: Leo for frizzy, Pisces for damp, and Capricorn for difficult to part. It was meant as satire, but the joke backfired. Several readers took it seriously, and one Dutch noblewoman reportedly demanded a Capricorn-style updo for her daughter's wedding. The style required 6 braids and 2 hours of silent regret. These connections between appearance and the cosmos went deeper during moments of personal transition. Young scholars hoping to pass exams might visit both an astrologer and a barber the night before a major test. The logic one arranged the heavens, the other, the forehead. Lovers consulted birth charts to determine whether to grow their hair out or trim it short, believing certain lengths attracted or repelled romance depending on Venus's position. Some went further still. In Florence, a short-lived trend called Stella shearing involved trimming one's hair in accordance with lunar phases. Full moon for boldness, crescent for discretion. No moon, keep your hat on. This obsession even entered academic circles. A manuscript from 1675 titled The Harmonies of Face and Firmament suggested that true genius emerged only when one's hairline formed a golden angle, with the nose ideally mirrored by the inclination of Polaris. The author, whose own nose was somewhat off-center, included detailed diagrams, a few equations, and touchingly, a small sketch of his barber in the margins. It's unclear whether the paper was ever published, but copies survive, often smudged with what appears to be pomade. By the end of the century, Enlightenment thinkers were beginning to sweep away such ideas. Hair lost its heavenly assignments, and science distanced itself from the salons. Still, traces of this curious era linger. You'll find them in the idea that you look better during a full moon, or that your hair has a mind of its own when Mercury's in retrograde, or in the small private rituals we perform before big days, a comb here, a spritz there, a glance upward, as if asking the sky, are we good? So, tonight, as you lie beneath the same stars once watched by Kepler, Galileo, and a dozen other sleepless minds with cold feet and fabulous wigs, remember, even the greatest astronomers sometimes paused to fix their part. Even they wondered whether Saturn approved of sideburns. Tonight, we return to where many 17th century anxieties began, not in a barbershop or under the stars, but in a mirror. Or rather, what passed for a mirror back then, a polished disc of blown glass, often warped at the edges, with just enough clarity to show your reflection, and possibly your sins. Because in an age when people blamed comets for bad haircuts and birthmarks for bad luck, the simple act of looking at oneself became a strange and sometimes mystical experience, especially when your hair refused to behave. For the well-to-do mirrors were prized objects, expensive, finicky, and often imported. But they weren't just for vanity. They were instruments of introspection, often literally. A crooked curl could mean your soul is out of line. A faded shine in your hair might imply a spiritual dimming. Some households believed that reflections could lie especially during certain celestial alignments. There are recorded cases where people refused to comb their hair by candlelight during a lunar eclipse, fearing that their mirror image would borrow their luck and flee into the glass. It gets stranger. There were households that draped mirrors entirely during thunderstorms or comets, believing that celestial energy could fracture the self if seen through a reflective surface. In Venice, one nobleman wrote that he only dared brush his hair while looking into a bowl of still water because glass carried too much memory. In Prague, a popular superstition warned that breaking a mirror while adjusting your wig meant 7 years of public humiliation, not bad luck in general, just fashion-specific shame, which, depending on your social circle, might have been worse. For those without glass-polished pewter or darkened windows, sometimes stood in. These distorted surfaces created reflections that were more suggestion than image. Still, people examined them carefully. Some believed you could tell your fortune by observing how your fringe fell naturally after sleep. If it curled toward the left, it meant challenges. If to the right, prosperity. If straight down, indecision. If it refused to fall at all, congratulations, you were a philosopher. This obsession with reflected identity birthed a quiet trend among the more poetic types, the keeping of mirror diaries. These were journals where people recorded what their reflection looked like each day, often in metaphors. A typical entry might read, "Face dull, like a shuttered moon. Hair flat Saturn watches me." Some entries were even more theatrical, eyes blank as boiled milk. Curls spiral like frightened eels. Avoid company. Over time, these mirror diaries became emotional barometers, tracking not just grooming, but mood memory and social temperature. One historian discovered a diary in rural Austria with 37 pages, solely devoted to frustrations of the fringe. The church, of course, had opinions. Some clerics warned against excessive reflection, claiming it led to vanity and distraction from moral duties. In a 1692 sermon, one preacher thundered, "Beware the sylvan pane that tempts the eye from heaven's gaze to its own pomp," which might have had more impact if he hadn't been wearing powdered curls and very well-fitted stockings. Yet, for all the superstition and caution, the act of self-grooming remained intimate and oddly brave. To stand before a mirror and fix your hair knowing that a comet might flare, a wig might slip, or a stranger might see was in some way to declare yourself ready for the day, ready to face whatever cosmic mischief or powdered nonsense awaited you. And in a world where storms, omens, and astrology could rewrite your fate overnight, that kind of quiet self-possession mattered. It still does. Every time you smooth your hair in a mirror, you're practicing an ancient ritual, one part control, one part hope, and maybe one part defiance. You're saying, "This is me, messy part and all." So tonight, as you drift off beneath the stars, maybe facing your own reflection in the screen before bed, remember this people once whispered to candlelit mirrors and braided their worries into curls. You lucky, you just have to swipe left. Tonight, our journey winds toward its end, not with a bang, but with a quiet stroke of the comb, the fading shimmer of a comet, and one last sigh from a forgotten century that always tried to make sense of the sky through its own messy strands of hair. You've walked through court salons, stormy fields, dusty observatories, candlelit bedrooms, and the peculiar minds of those who once truly believed that the stars had something to say about their split ends. And now, as the firelight dwindles and the night stretches longer, we arrive at the closing thought of all these strange, sincere rituals that hair, for all its mundanity, might have been the most human way to touch the divine. In the 17th century, everything had a meaning, or at least everyone was trying to give it one. A sudden wind wasn't just a breeze, it was God's whisper. A birthmark wasn't skin, it was fate's fingerprint. And a bad haircut, that was cosmic turbulence manifesting through your scalp. Whether you were a stargazer, a soldier, a servant, or a duchess with 6-foot wigs that could topple nations, or dinnerware, you were expected to manage not just your life, but also your appearance as part of the great celestial narrative. And people did, tirelessly. Every hair ritual we've whispered through in these past parts, whether combing with poetry, burying trimmings under floorboards, or styling with the planets in mind, was rooted in something tender, a need to control what couldn't be controlled, to impose rhythm on a chaotic world, to make the night sky feel just a little more like home. There was something especially poignant about how they imagined hair as a thread between the self and the stars. Hair grows quietly and visibly like time. You don't see it happen, but one day it's longer, one day it changed. It curls when it rains. It lightens when you forget the sun. It breaks when you're tired. And in an era before science had cleaned the dust off the cosmos, that slow, fragile process felt sacred, like your soul unfolding filament by filament. For many, that belief gave structure to their days. You brushed your hair before bed, not just to keep it neat, but to close the door on the day's chaos. You trimmed your ends during specific moon phases because it was comforting to think that timing mattered. You feared comets because they arrived without warning, disrupted everything, and then vanished like illness, heartbreak, or bad news written in silver across the sky. And if your hair misbehaved during such a week, well, who could blame it? These weren't just old wives' tales. They were emotional technologies, ways of coping before therapy, before weather forecasts, and before Google. A mother combing her daughter's hair while muttering protections against sky fire was doing more than grooming. She was instilling calm, building memory, and teaching care. A philosopher brushing his beard while pondering Saturn wasn't delusional. He was finding rhythm in uncertainty. A lonely woman whispering her secrets into a boar bristle brush before bed wasn't silly. She was keeping herself company. Even those who laughed at the rituals often followed them, just in case. And isn't that still true? We make fun of astrology, then check our horoscopes. We roll our eyes at Mercury in retrograde, then blame it when our Wi-Fi drops mid-zoom. We tell ourselves appearances don't matter, then fuss over our hair before an interview. Superstition may change its clothes, but it never quite leaves the room. In that way, the 17th century wasn't so different from now. We're still trying to understand how the intangible grief, luck, joy timing intertwines with the tangible. How a haircut can feel like a new beginning. How a change in the sky can stir something deep in our chest. How staring at our own reflection in moments of doubt or celebration feels like staring into something older than glass. Something cosmic. Perhaps that's why hair of all things carried so much emotional weight. Unlike clothes, it can't be easily changed. Unlike words, it doesn't forget what it's been through. And unlike beliefs, it doesn't need to be rational. It just grows, silently, faithfully, reflecting our seasons, our whims, our identities, sometimes even our fears. By the late 1600s, many of these rituals began to fade. Enlightenment thinkers pushed for reason over rhyme. Telescopes grew sharper. Science marched in with diagrams and formulas and new vocabularies that couldn't be braided into a bedtime prayer. But in small corners, people kept brushing their hair at certain hours, kept wearing hats when Venus dipped low, kept believing at least a little that the universe noticed them. And now, hundreds of years later, you've kept those echoes alive just by listening, by lying here in the hush of your own night, letting these odd, lovely fragments drift into your thoughts. Maybe you'll forget the details by morning. Maybe you won't remember who believed what or which planet ruined which fringe. But I hope you remember this: every superstition, no matter how silly, was rooted in a desire to feel in rhythm with something vast, to feel seen by the stars, to believe that even your bad hair day had a reason. So let your dreams tonight carry you gently. Let them tangle and smooth and curl like stories whispered into your pillow. Let the old world pass quietly through your thoughts, candle-lit and curious, full of people who looked up at the same sky as you and said, "I wonder if it's me or the moon." So now the lights are low, the comets have passed, the powdered wigs are resting quietly in their velvet-lined drawers, and the last brush-stroke of the night has been drawn across the centuries. You're lying still warm beneath your blanket, perhaps, with the soft hum of a fan in the background, just enough to mimic the wind beyond the palace walls. The story, absurd and gentle, is done for tonight. But before you drift away, let me remind you of something quiet and true. The people we've met, the astronomers with crooked partings, the duchesses with sky-shaped hair, the philosophers brushing their beards like it would tame the universe, they were just like you. Tired sometimes, hopeful often, messy always. They looked up and wondered, and they looked inward and worried. They tried to explain life through whatever tools they had, stars, scissors, superstition, and yes, the occasional braid tied with moonlight and nerves. You don't have to believe in hair horoscopes or wig-born prophecies to find comfort in that. You only have to believe that you too are part of the rhythm, that your small gestures, brushing your hair, adjusting your pillow, listening quietly in the dark, are echoes of something tender and ancient. So, exhale. Let the tension melt from your scalp. Let the old superstitions fade like mist. You've traveled far tonight, and now it's time to return home. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.